Hey there, welcome to Bread Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. I'm writing this to share something that happened to me not too long ago. Something that changed everything about how I view the world. You see, I took a job as a night security guard at a manufacturing plant on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon. It seemed like easy money at the time, and I figured my experience from my previous job watching over Lincoln Elementary School would serve me well. Boy, was I wrong. My wife Sarah wasn't thrilled about the position. The plant was located in an industrial district that had seen better days, where gang activity was still a real concern, and police response times could stretch 20 minutes or more. But I reassured her that I'd be safe inside the facility, locked away from any street-level troubles. The pay was decent enough to help us catch up on some bills, so I signed the contract without hesitation. The facility itself was massive, more like an aircraft hangar than a traditional factory. The corrugated metal roof stretched high above, and during those cold February nights when I started, the whole place felt like being inside a giant refrigerator. The heating system was ancient and barely functional, leaving me bundled up in multiple layers just to stay comfortable during my rounds. My first week passed without incident. I'd patrol the perimeter at regular intervals, monitor the security cameras, and file my reports. The work was monotonous but straightforward. Then came that Saturday night in mid-February when everything went sideways. I was conducting my usual midnight rounds when I heard distinct footsteps echoing from somewhere above me. The sound was clear and rhythmic, like someone pacing back and forth across the metal roofing. I stopped dead in my tracks, listening intently. The roof had to be at least 30 feet high. There was no way anyone could access it without serious equipment or help from the inside. I stepped outside into the bitter cold, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. I scanned the roofline with my flashlight, but the beam barely reached high enough to illuminate the gutters, let alone anyone who might be up there. After several minutes of searching, I convinced myself it might have been debris blown by the wind, or maybe even animals. Urban coyotes weren't unheard of in that area. I returned to my post and tried to focus on other tasks, but around 5 a.m, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Screaming. Not human screaming, something else entirely. The sounds were guttural, anguished, and seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They echoed through the metal walls of the plant like the building itself was crying out in pain. I grabbed my radio and tried to contact dispatch, but got only static. My cell phone showed no signal bars, which was strange because I'd had full coverage earlier in the evening. I spent the next hour checking every corner of the facility, but found nothing that could explain what I'd heard. By the time my shift ended at 7, I was exhausted and deeply unsettled. The next night, the footsteps returned with a vengeance. This time, they were more aggressive, like someone stomping rather than walking. I went outside immediately and shouted up at the roof, demanding to know who was there. My voice echoed off the surrounding buildings, but no one answered. "This is private property," I called out. "I'm calling the police." But when I tried to use the landline in the security office, there was no dial tone. The internet connection was down too, despite all the cables appearing to be properly connected. The timing felt too convenient to be coincidental. For about an hour, the noise stopped. I began to think whoever was up there had finally given up and left. I was wrong. At 3:15 in the morning, while I was walking through the main production area, I heard a tremendous crash from outside, like something heavy had fallen from a great height and struck the concrete. I ran to investigate, circling the entire building, but found nothing on the ground. No debris, no person, nothing to explain the sound I'd clearly heard. That's when I realized the footsteps above had stopped completely. And that's when I heard movement inside the building with me. The sound came from behind one of the large manufacturing machines, a soft scraping noise, like fabric dragging across metal. My heart started pounding as I realized that whatever had been on the roof was now inside the facility with me. But how? I'd been outside checking the perimeter. All the doors were locked, and I would have seen anyone trying to break in. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing in the vast space. "I know someone's in here." I pulled out my flashlight and started moving toward the source of the noise, each step feeling like it took forever. The beam of light cut through the darkness, casting long shadows between the machinery. And then I saw it, a figure standing behind one of the larger pieces of equipment, partially hidden but clearly visible. The shape was wrong somehow, too tall and thin, with proportions that didn't quite make sense. I could only see part of it in the darkness, but something about its stillness was deeply unnerving. It wasn't hiding exactly, more like it was waiting. I raised my flashlight to get a better look, but the moment the beam hit the figure, it simply wasn't there anymore. I blinked hard, certain my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I lowered the light, I could see the silhouette again, now fully visible and seemingly closer than before. My hands started shaking. The temperature in the building seemed to drop another 10 degrees, and I could feel something oppressive settling over the entire space. This wasn't just someone trespassing. This was something else entirely, something that didn't belong in our world. I'm a religious man, always have been, so I started praying under my breath as I slowly backed toward the exit. The Lord's Prayer, Hail Marys, anything I could remember from childhood. It was the only defense I had against whatever was stalking me through that factory. That's when I heard the laughter. It was a sound I'll never forget, cold, mocking, and definitely masculine. But it echoed strangely, like it was coming from multiple directions at once. And then, clear as day, I heard words that made my blood freeze in my veins. "I am God." I didn't wait around to hear anything else. I ran for the exit like my life depended on it, leaving behind my thermos, my logbook, and what was left of my dignity. I drove home with tears streaming down my face, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. The 20-minute drive felt like it took hours. The next morning, I submitted my resignation without giving the real reason for leaving. I told them I'd found a better opportunity closer to home. It wasn't until months later, when I was working my current job at a day shift security position downtown, that I learned the truth about that place. My new supervisor, Marcus, was a longtime Portland resident who knew the history of every industrial building in the area. When I mentioned where I'd previously worked, his expression changed immediately. "You worked the night shift at the Riverside manufacturing plant," he asked, looking genuinely concerned. Man, I can't believe they're still trying to staff that place. He went on to explain that the building was relatively new, constructed in 2016 on the site of an old abandoned warehouse. But between 2008 and 2015, that warehouse had been used by a particularly violent drug cartel for interrogations, executions, and worse. Local police estimated that dozens of people had died horrible deaths within those walls. The most disturbing detail was that the cartel had practiced some form of occult rituals there, believing it would protect their operations and give them power over their enemies. Multiple witnesses had reported strange ceremonies involving candles, symbols carved into the concrete floor, and chanting that could be heard from blocks away during the darkest hours of the night. Marcus shook his head as he finished the story. I'm amazed you lasted more than one night there. Most people can feel something's wrong with that place the moment they walk in. The fact that you made it through multiple shifts shows you've got more courage than sense. He was right about that. If I'd known the history of that building before accepting the job, I never would have set foot inside. The thought of spending 8 hours alone in a place where so much suffering had occurred, especially during the overnight hours, when whatever lingered there seemed most active, still gives me nightmares. I've since learned that I wasn't the first security guard to quit that job under mysterious circumstances. The company has had trouble keeping anyone in that position for more than a few weeks, but they keep posting the job listing, and people keep taking it, probably because the pay is better than average, and they don't disclose why the turnover rate is so high. Sometimes I wonder if what I encountered that night was just my imagination, amplified by stress and the creepy atmosphere of an empty industrial building. But deep down, I know what I saw and heard was real. Some places hold onto the darkness that occurred within their walls, and the Riverside plant is definitely one of them. I still work security, but only during daylight hours and never alone in buildings with questionable histories. Some lessons you only need to learn once, and I learned mine the hard way in that factory on the outskirts of Portland. Whatever was in there with me that night, I pray I never encounter anything like it again. I need to share something that happened to me during my first job in America, even though I signed a confidentiality agreement saying I wouldn't talk about it. But some things are too important to keep quiet, especially when other people might end up in the same situation I was in. I moved to Phoenix from Guadalajara when I was 19, chasing the American dream like so many others before me. My first real job was as a night security guard at Westgate Commons, a mid-sized shopping center in one of the older parts of the city. It wasn't exactly the Scottsdale Fashion Square, but it had about 40 stores spread across 2 levels and stayed busy enough during the day. The hiring manager, a middle-aged woman named Janet, seemed almost too eager to give me the position. She mentioned that they'd had trouble keeping guards on the night shift, with most people quitting after just a week or 2. When I asked why, she gave me some vague answer about the hours being difficult and the pay not being competitive enough. But the money she offered me was actually pretty good for entry-level security work, which should have been my first red flag. I started on a Tuesday evening in late September. The mall closed at 9, and my shift ran from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. Janet spent the afternoon showing me around, explaining the camera system, introducing me to the maintenance crew, and going over emergency procedures. The layout was fairly straightforward. The first floor had mostly chain stores, a GameStop, a Spencer's, a couple of cell phone shops, and a large anchor store that sold electronics. The second floor was where things got more interesting, with several boutique clothing stores, a jewelry shop, and what Janet called their flagship fashion retailer. A store called Mannequin Dreams that specialized in high-end women's clothing. That store gets the most foot traffic during the day, Janet explained, as we walked past the large windows filled with incredibly lifelike mannequins. But it's also where we've had some incidents. She didn't elaborate on what kind of incidents, and I didn't push for details. I figured I'd learn whatever I needed to know through experience. After Janet left, I decided to grab a quick dinner from one of the vending machines in the food court. While I was eating, an older Mexican man approached me. He was wearing a janitor's uniform and looked like he'd been working there for years. "You're the new night guard," he said in Spanish, sitting down across from me. "I'm Miguel. I've been cleaning this place for about 3 years now." We chatted for a while about our families, our hometowns, and the challenges of working in a new country. But I could tell Miguel had something else on his mind. He kept glancing around nervously, like he was worried someone might overhear us. "Listen," he finally said, lowering his voice. "I don't want to scare you, and I don't want you to think I'm crazy, but there's something you should know about working here at night." I leaned forward, curious. The guards who work this shift, they don't usually last long. There have been maybe 6 or 7 in the past 2 years. They all quit suddenly, usually without giving notice. Some of them just stopped showing up. Miguel paused, choosing his words carefully. "There's something wrong with that clothing store upstairs. Mannequin Dreams, the guards. They say things happen there after the mall closes, things that can't be explained." He told me about Carlos, the previous guard, who claimed he'd seen the mannequins moving around inside the store. Carlos had also reported hearing conversations coming from the shop, even though it was supposed to be empty and locked up tight. Then there was the incident with the little girl and her mother. A 5-year-old had wandered away from her mom while they were shopping, and when they found her 20 minutes later, she was crying hysterically in a corner of the store. The child kept saying that one of the mannequins had spoken to her, asking if it could borrow her eyes. The mother demanded to see the security footage, convinced that an employee had said something inappropriate to her daughter. But the store manager refused to show the recordings, and the family left without getting any answers. "I've worked here long enough to know when something's not right," Miguel said. "Those mannequins, they're too realistic. Sometimes when I'm cleaning near that store, I feel like they're watching me. And the way their position changes from night to night, even though the store employees swear they don't move them." I thanked Miguel for the warning, but honestly, I was skeptical. I'd grown up hearing ghost stories from my grandmother, and while I respected the supernatural, I'd never experienced anything myself. Besides, I needed this job. My aunt had already done enough to help me get settled in Phoenix, and I couldn't afford to be picky about employment. My shift officially started at 10 o'clock. The mall grew quiet as the last shoppers and employees filtered out, leaving me alone with the security cameras and my thoughts. For the first few hours, everything was routine. I monitored the feeds, did my initial walkthrough, and familiarized myself with the building's sounds and rhythms. Around 1 in the morning, I noticed movement on one of the second-floor cameras. It was subtle, just a shift in shadows near the entrance to Mannequin Dreams. I switched to a closer view, but the angle wasn't great and the lighting was dim. Still, I could have sworn I saw something moving inside the store. I grabbed my flashlight and headed upstairs to investigate. The second floor was eerily quiet, with only the emergency exit signs providing any illumination. As I approached Mannequin Dreams, I could see the silhouettes of the mannequins through the large display windows. They were positioned throughout the store in various poses, wearing the latest fashions. The mannequins were incredibly lifelike, more so than any I'd seen before. Their faces had detailed features, realistic skin tones, and glass eyes that seemed to follow you as you moved. Even their hair looked natural, styled in contemporary cuts and colors. I stood outside the locked entrance, shining my flashlight through the window to get a better look. Everything appeared normal. The mannequins were arranged in small groups, some standing, others sitting on benches or leaning against displays. Their positions seemed natural enough, though I had to admit there was something unsettling about how human they looked. After a few minutes of observation, I returned to the security office downstairs. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been different about the scene inside the store. One of the mannequins near the front window, a female figure in a red dress, had been sitting on a small bench when I'd first walked past. But when I'd returned with my flashlight, she was standing upright. I tried to convince myself that I was misremembering, that the stress of a new job and Miguel's warnings were making me paranoid. But the doubt lingered. Around 3 in the morning, I began my second round of the building. The first floor was unchanged, but as I climbed the stairs to the second level, I heard something that made me freeze in place. Laughter. But not normal human laughter. It sounded artificial, like a recording played through old speakers or a voice synthesizer trying to mimic human emotion. I forced myself to continue up the stairs, telling myself it was probably just the building's ventilation system, or maybe sounds from the street filtering through the walls. But as I approached Mannequin Dreams, the laughter grew clearer. It was definitely coming from inside the store. I positioned myself in front of the display windows and looked inside. The scene was exactly as I'd left it earlier, with one exception. The mannequin in the red dress was once again sitting on the bench near the front of the store. I was certain she'd been standing when I'd checked before, but now she was seated in the exact position I remembered from my first pass. My heart started racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. I pressed my face against the glass, straining to see deeper into the store. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The seated mannequin's head was turned toward the window, toward me. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. When I looked again, the mannequin was facing forward, just like all the others. But I knew what I had seen. For just a moment, that thing had been looking directly at me with those glass eyes. I practically ran back to the security office, my mind racing with explanations that all seemed inadequate. Maybe the building was settling, causing the mannequin to shift slightly. Maybe the lighting was playing tricks on my perception. Maybe I was more tired than I'd realized. But when I checked the camera feed for the second floor, what I saw made my blood turn to ice. The mannequin in the red dress was standing in the middle of the store, directly in front of the camera. She wasn't posed naturally like the others. She was standing completely upright, arms at her sides, staring directly into the lens. And she was waving. Slowly, deliberately, like she knew I was watching. I blinked hard and looked again, but she was gone. Back to her seated position on the bench, facing away from the camera just like before. My hands were shaking as I rewound the footage, but there was nothing there. No record of the mannequin moving, no evidence of what I'd just witnessed. Either the camera had malfunctioned at exactly the wrong moment, or something was happening that couldn't be captured on video. I tried to calm myself down, turning on some music and focusing on other areas of the mall. But 20 minutes later, movement on the same camera caught my attention again. This time it wasn't just one mannequin. The entire display window was filled with figures, all facing the camera. Men, women, and children in various outfits, all standing perfectly still but clearly positioned to be seen. And they were all waving. The sight was so surreal and terrifying that I actually fell out of my chair. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I switched to a different camera view, then back again. But the mannequins had returned to their normal positions. I lasted until sunrise, but barely. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound seemed amplified, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from multiple directions. When my replacement arrived at 6, I could barely manage a coherent handoff. I quit that same day. Janet seemed surprised, but not entirely shocked when I submitted my resignation. She asked if I was sure, offering to put me on a different shift or transfer me to one of their other properties. But I was done. I couldn't imagine spending another night in that place, wondering if those things upstairs would eventually find a way out of their store. I found another security job within a week, working days at an office complex downtown. It paid slightly less, but I could sleep peacefully at night knowing I'd never have to see those mannequins again. A few months later, I ran into Miguel at a grocery store. He told me that the mall had hired another night guard to replace me, a young guy from El Salvador. That guard had lasted exactly 4 nights before disappearing entirely. He'd simply stopped showing up for work and couldn't be reached by phone. "They're still looking for someone," Miguel said. "The ad's been running in the paper for 2 months now." I never went back to find out what happened to that place. But sometimes, when I'm in other shopping centers or clothing stores, I find myself avoiding the mannequin displays. Because now I know that some of them might be watching back, waiting for the right moment to ask if they can borrow something from you. Something you might not get back. My name is Eric, and I want to share something that happened to me several years ago when I was working as a security guard at the county morgue in Birmingham, Alabama. A friend of mine named Tommy got me the job. He worked there as a maintenance supervisor and knew they needed someone reliable for the night shift. At first, the idea didn't bother me much. I've always believed that the living are far more dangerous than the dead, and the pay was significantly better than what I'd been making at my previous job. The only downside was the overnight schedule, which took some getting used to, but I needed the work and couldn't afford to be choosy. The Jefferson County Morgue was a single-story concrete building located behind the main hospital complex. It had been built in the 1970s and looked every bit its age: institutional beige walls, fluorescent lighting that hummed constantly, and that particular smell of industrial disinfectant that never quite masked the underlying odors of the place. My job was straightforward enough. I worked from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, monitoring the building from a security booth near the main entrance. Most nights, there were medical examiners and technicians working inside, so I rarely had to enter the facility itself. I'd patrol the exterior periodically, check the parking areas, and log everyone who entered or left the building. For the first several months, it was routine work. The night shift medical staff were professional and friendly, often stopping by my booth to chat during their breaks. Dr. Martinez, the chief medical examiner, was particularly kind. A soft-spoken man in his 50s who'd been working there since the building opened. The incident that changed everything happened on a cold Tuesday night in January. I'd been at the job for about 8 months by then and had settled into a comfortable routine. Around 10:30, just before the facility officially closed to outside visitors, Dr. Martinez called me from his car. "Eric, I think I left my cell phone in the reception area," he said. "I'm already home, and my wife's been trying to reach me. Could you do me a favor and check the front desk? I was filling out some paperwork there earlier." I told him I'd be happy to help and made my way inside. The reception area was dimly lit by a single desk lamp, casting long shadows across the waiting room chairs and magazine racks. I found Dr. Martinez's phone exactly where he'd said it would be, plugged into a charging cable behind the reception desk. As I was unplugging the device, I heard something that made me freeze. A voice calling my name from somewhere deeper in the building. "Eric, Eric." The sound was faint but distinct, like someone speaking in a hushed tone from the far end of the main corridor. I looked up from the phone, listening intently. The building should have been empty except for me. All the staff had signed out through my checkpoint, and I'd verified that the parking lot was clear. "Hello," I called out. "Is someone there?" No response. I clipped my radio to my shirt and grabbed my flashlight, knowing I needed to investigate. Someone could have broken in, though I couldn't imagine why anyone would target a morgue. Still, it was my job to secure the building, and I took that responsibility seriously. The main corridor stretched about 60 feet from the reception area to the examination rooms at the back of the building. Halfway down the hall, I could see light coming from under the door to the primary autopsy suite. That struck me as odd. Dr. Martinez had been meticulous about turning off all the lights when he left, and I'd seen him do his final walkthrough just an hour earlier. As I moved closer to the lighted room, I saw a shadow pass by the gap under the door. Someone was definitely inside, moving around slowly and deliberately. My heart rate picked up as I realized this wasn't just my imagination or a false alarm. I pulled out my radio to call for backup, but before I could key the microphone, my phone rang. It was Dr. Martinez. "Did you find my phone?" he asked. "Yes, sir, I have it right here, but we might have a problem. There's someone in the building, in the main examination room. I can see the lights are on, and there's movement inside." Dr. Martinez was quiet for a moment. "That's impossible, Eric. I personally turned off all the lights in that room before I left. And those doors are locked with a keypad. Only staff members know the combination." "Well, someone's in there," I insisted. "I can see them moving around." "I'm calling the police and heading back there myself," he said. "Don't confront whoever it is." Just keep an eye on the situation until help arrives." I agreed and hung up, but something compelled me to get a closer look before the authorities arrived. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was a sense of duty, but I found myself walking toward that door despite every instinct telling me to wait in the security booth. The light under the door suddenly went out. I stopped in my tracks, straining to hear any sound from inside the room. After several minutes of silence, I carefully approached the door and tried the handle. It turned easily, which surprised me since Dr. Martinez had said it should be locked. I pushed the door open slowly, my flashlight ready. The room was large and sterile, with several examination tables arranged in rows. Each table held a body covered by a white sheet, which was standard procedure for overnight storage. I swept my flashlight across the room, checking each corner and shadow. Everything appeared normal at first glance. All the bodies were lying flat on their respective tables, properly covered and positioned. But as I was about to leave, something caught my attention. One of the bodies wasn't lying down. It was sitting upright on the table, still covered by the sheet, but clearly in a vertical position. The white fabric draped over the figure like a ghost costume, with no visible features, but an unmistakably human shape underneath. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, trying to process what I was seeing. Bodies don't sit up on their own. Someone had to have moved it, but there was no one else in the room. And yet, there it was, a corpse, sitting on an examination table, like it was waiting for something. Terror overwhelmed my rational thinking. I dropped my flashlight and ran from the room, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I made it to the main entrance just as Dr. Martinez was pulling into the parking lot. He took one look at my face and knew something was seriously wrong. "What happened in there?" he asked, getting out of his car quickly. I tried to explain, but I was still so shaken that my words came out in a jumbled rush. Dr. Martinez listened patiently, then headed straight for the examination room while I called the police as planned. A few minutes later, he called out to me from the back of the building. I found him standing in the doorway of the autopsy suite, looking at the examination tables with a grim expression. "Which one?" he asked simply. I pointed to the table where I'd seen the sitting figure. Dr. Martinez walked over and pulled back the sheet, revealing the body of a young man who appeared to be in his early 20s. Even in death, I could see evidence of severe trauma. Bruises, cuts, and other injuries that spoke to a violent end. "This is Marcus Williams," Dr. Martinez said quietly. 22 years old. He was reported missing 6 weeks ago after leaving work at a construction site downtown. His family received ransom demands for 3 weeks, but even after they paid, Marcus was never returned. A jogger found his body in Ruffner Mountain Park yesterday morning. The doctor continued, his voice heavy with sadness. "Since we brought him in, there have been disturbances in this room. Sounds, movements, things that can't be easily explained. This isn't the first time I've dealt with something like this, Eric. Bodies that suffered traumatic deaths sometimes seem restless, like they can't find peace." I stared at the young man's face, feeling a deep sadness for what he must have endured. "You're saying he was the one calling my name?" "I can't say for certain what you experienced," Dr. Martinez replied. "But I've learned not to dismiss these things entirely. Sometimes the dead need our help, even if we don't understand exactly what they're asking for. The police arrived a few minutes later and searched the building thoroughly, but found no signs of an intruder. They took my statement and filed a report, but there wasn't much they could do about a situation that had no clear explanation. After they left, Dr. Martinez and I sat in the reception area while he retrieved his phone. He asked me not to discuss the incident with other staff members, both to protect the facility's reputation and to avoid frightening people unnecessarily. "This job isn't for everyone," he said. "I've seen good people leave because they couldn't handle the weight of what happens here. No one would blame you if you decided to find work elsewhere." I spent the rest of that week thinking about his words. When I got home each morning, I'd lie in bed replaying that moment when I saw Marcus sitting up on the table. Had he been trying to communicate something? Was he asking for help, for justice, for peace? I never got a clear answer to those questions, but I knew I couldn't continue working there. The image of that young man, brutally murdered and somehow still struggling to be heard, haunted my dreams and filled my waking hours with anxiety. I gave my 2 weeks' notice and helped train my replacement, a former security guard from the hospital who seemed better equipped to handle the psychological challenges of the job. On my last night, I made a point of stopping by Marcus Williams' table and saying a prayer for his soul, hoping he would find the rest that had been stolen from him in life. I've worked other security jobs since then, but never again in a place where death was the primary business. Some experiences change you permanently, and that night in the Birmingham County morgue was one of them. I learned that the boundary between the living and the dead isn't as clear as most people believe, and sometimes the departed need our help in ways we can't fully understand. Marcus Williams deserved better than the life he was given and the death he suffered. I hope that somewhere, somehow, he finally found the peace that eluded him in those examination rooms where his body waited for justice that might never come. I need to tell this story without revealing my real name, as I still fear for my safety even now. This happened to me several years ago in downtown Chicago when I was desperate for work and took a job as a night security guard at a small office building. The building was nothing special, just 6 stories of aging brick and concrete in the financial district. The owner was some wealthy businessman who rented out the floors as office space to various companies. He rarely showed up, preferring to manage things remotely through his property manager. My job was simple enough. Sit in the lobby from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., monitor the security cameras, and report any issues. When they hired me, there was only one rule that seemed odd. I was never, under any circumstances, to go to the 6th floor. They told me it was undergoing renovations and was completely off limits. Only the owner had access, and he had his own private key. The property manager, a nervous man named Richards, made me sign an additional waiver acknowledging this restriction. At the time, I just figured it was some insurance liability thing and didn't think much of it. The first few weeks were uneventfully boring. I'd sit at the security desk, scroll through my phone, maybe walk the lower floors to stretch my legs. The building had that typical corporate atmosphere, beige carpets, fluorescent lighting, and the lingering smell of coffee and copy toner. The security cameras showed the usual nothing. Empty hallways, darkened offices, the occasional rat scurrying across the basement level. But then came that Tuesday night in November. I remember it was unusually cold for early fall, and the building's heating system was making those settling noises old buildings make. I was on my routine patrol of the fourth floor when I heard it, a rhythmic banging coming from directly above me. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't the random noise of pipes or settling. This was deliberate, like someone hitting a wall or door with their fist. I stood perfectly still, listening. The sound continued, growing more frantic and desperate. My first instinct was to ignore it. I wasn't supposed to go up there, and I needed this job. But the banging became more intense, almost violent. What if there was an emergency? What if someone was trapped up there? Against my better judgment, I took the elevator to the 6th floor. The doors opened to reveal a long, dimly lit hallway with stained carpet and peeling wallpaper, clearly not under renovation, as I'd been told. At the far end was a single door, and that's where the sounds were coming from. As I approached, I could hear the banging was coming from inside the room, not someone knocking to get in. Someone was trapped inside, hitting the door from the other side. When I reached the door, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were 3 different deadbolts on the outside of the door. Not the inside where they should be for privacy, but on the outside, like a prison cell. I tried the handle, but of course it was locked. I called out, "Hello, is someone in there? Are you okay?" The banging stopped immediately, replaced by muffled sounds that might have been someone trying to speak through a gag. Then my radio crackled to life. "What the hell are you doing up there?" It was Richards, and he sounded furious. "I heard noises, sir. I think someone might be trapped." "Get down from there right now. The owner is watching the cameras, and he's livid. If you don't want to be fired and possibly arrested for trespassing, you'll get back to your post immediately." The owner was watching. At 2 in the morning, I looked around for cameras, but didn't see any obvious ones on this floor. Still, I could hear Richards breathing heavily on the radio, waiting for my response. "Yes, sir, I'm coming down now." I returned to the lobby, but I couldn't shake what I'd heard. Someone was definitely up there, and they were in distress. But who? And why were they locked in from the outside? 3 nights passed without incident, though I found myself constantly glancing at the monitor showing the 6th floor elevator area. Then it happened again, the same desperate banging. But this time it seemed even more frantic. I made a decision that would change my life forever. I grabbed a crowbar from the maintenance closet and headed back up to the 6th floor. The banging grew louder as I approached the door. This time, I knocked back twice and called out, "If you need help, knock twice back." 2 deliberate knocks answered me. My hands were shaking as I worked the crowbar against the first deadbolt. The metal screamed as it gave way. The second lock was harder, but desperation gave me strength. As I worked on the third and final lock, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting Richards or worse to appear at any moment. When the door finally swung open, I stepped into a nightmare. The room was larger than I expected, stretching back into shadows that my flashlight couldn't fully penetrate. But what I could see made me want to run screaming from the building. On the floor in front of me was a man in his 50s, his hands and feet bound with zip ties, duct tape over his mouth. His eyes were wide with terror and relief. But he wasn't alone in that room. Along the walls were glass display cases, like the kind you'd see in a museum. But instead of artifacts, they contained human bodies in various stages of preservation. Some looked like they'd been there for weeks, others much longer. In the corner stood a large industrial freezer, its low hum the only sound besides our breathing. I stood frozen, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just a kidnapping. This was the workshop of a serial killer. The bound man was making urgent noises through his gag, trying to tell me something. I snapped out of my shock and quickly cut his restraints with a utility knife from my belt, then carefully removed the tape from his mouth. "Please," he gasped, his voice hoarse from screaming. "We have to get out of here now. He's coming back tonight," he told me. He told me I was next. "Who did this to you? How long have you been here?" "Peterson, the building owner. He approached me about a business deal 3 weeks ago, said he had an investment opportunity. When I met him at his office, he drugged my coffee. I woke up here." His eyes darted to the display cases. "He's been doing this for years. He told me all about it while I was tied up. He likes to keep trophies." I helped him to his feet, but he could barely stand. His legs were weak from being bound for so long. We had to get out of there, but I'd left my phone downstairs and my radio only connected to Richards, who might be in on this. We'd barely made it halfway down the hall when all the lights in the building went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a few seconds later, casting everything in an eerie red glow. We could hear the elevator moving. Someone was coming up. "The stairs," I whispered, supporting most of the man's weight as we stumbled toward the emergency exit. But as we reached the stairwell door, we heard footsteps echoing from below, someone climbing toward us. "There's nowhere to run," a calm voice called from the stairwell. It was a voice I'd never heard before, but I knew it had to be Peterson. We retreated back toward the room, the man I'd rescued whimpering with terror. I pulled him into the nightmare chamber and barricaded the door with a heavy desk, but I knew it wouldn't hold for long. Peterson began pounding on the door, no longer bothering to hide his intentions. "You've seen too much now," he called through the wood. "But don't worry, you'll join my collection soon enough." The door splintered as he threw his weight against it. I grabbed a scalpel from a tray of surgical instruments. God knows what he'd used those for, and prepared to defend us both. When Peterson finally broke through, he was nothing like I'd imagined. He was tall and thin, wearing an expensive suit that was now disheveled from his climb up the stairs. His face was eerily calm, almost pleasant, like a banker about to discuss a mortgage. He lunged for me with surprising speed, his hands going for my throat. His grip was incredibly strong, and black spots began dancing in my vision. Just as I thought I was going to pass out, the man I'd rescued struck Peterson in the head with the crowbar I'd dropped. Peterson crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath his skull. We didn't wait to see if he was dead. Supporting each other, we made it to the lobby where I called 911 with shaking hands. The police arrived within minutes, followed by what seemed like half of Chicago's emergency services. The investigation revealed that Peterson had been operating his gruesome hobby for over 15 years. The bodies they found were identified as missing persons going back more than a decade, people who'd simply vanished without a trace. The man I'd rescued, a local businessman named David Chen, was the only victim they'd managed to save alive. Peterson survived his head injury, but was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The building was demolished 6 months later, though I heard rumors that city workers found more remains in the basement and sub-basement levels that had never appeared on the building plans. I left Chicago shortly after the trial. Even though Peterson was locked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone like him doesn't work alone. I still have nightmares about that room, about the faces I saw in those display cases. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear that desperate banging on my bedroom wall. They say Peterson keeps to himself in prison, but I've heard he still gets mail from admirers, people fascinated by what he did. That thought terrifies me more than anything else, that there are others out there like him, inspired by his work. I never worked security again. Some experiences change you forever, and that night changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I've moved 3 times since then, always to smaller towns where people don't ask too many questions about your past. But I still check the locks on my doors twice every night before bed. And I still wake up sometimes, listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. My name is Gabriel, and I've been living in Northern California for over 20 years now, ever since I moved here from Mexico City. One of my first jobs was working as a night security guard at what used to be a Franciscan monastery, about 40 miles east of San Francisco, tucked away in the rolling hills where the fog never quite reaches. The property was massive, nearly 200 acres of oak trees and crumbling stone buildings that dated back to the 1800s. Some wealthy tech entrepreneur had bought the place and converted it into an event venue for Silicon Valley elite. Weddings, corporate retreats, charity galas, that sort of thing. But the place carried its history heavily, and that history was dark. What I didn't know when I took the job was that this monastery had a violent past. During the gold rush era, it had been used as more than just a place of worship. The monks who lived there had appointed themselves as moral judges of the surrounding mining camps, and their justice was swift and brutal. They'd bring people accused of crimes to the monastery for divine judgment, which usually meant torture and execution in the name of God. Records showed that over 300 people died on those grounds between 1850 and 1870. When the Catholic Church finally shut the place down and transferred the surviving monks elsewhere, the building sat empty for decades. Before being converted into the event space I was hired to guard. I worked the night shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 6 nights a week. My job was to patrol the grounds and make sure no vandals or trespassers disturbed the peace of whatever wealthy clientele happened to be sleeping off their champagne and caviar in the guest quarters. The main monastery building was still intact, an imposing structure of gray stone with narrow windows and heavy wooden doors. But there were also ruins scattered throughout the property. The remains of smaller buildings, crumbling walls, and what looked like the foundation of something that might have once been a prison or dungeon. I'd been working there about 3 weeks when I had my first encounter. It was a foggy Tuesday night in late October, the kind where the mist rolls in thick and muffles every sound. I was making my midnight rounds when I saw movement near the old bell tower, a section of the monastery that had partially collapsed decades ago and was now off limits to guests. Through the fog, I could make out a figure climbing the stone steps that led to what used to be the tower's entrance. The figure was wearing dark robes that billowed in the wind and moved with a strange, gliding motion that didn't look quite natural. I called out, "Hey, you can't be up there, it's not safe." The figure stopped but didn't turn around. In the dim light, I could see it was tall and thin, wearing what looked like a monk's habit, the kind with a deep hood that cast shadows over the face. I approached carefully, my flashlight cutting through the fog. "Sir, I need you to come down from there. This area is restricted." The figure turned toward me then, and I nearly dropped my flashlight. Where there should have been a face under that hood, there was only darkness. Not shadows, an absolute void, like looking into deep water at night. My rational mind was screaming that this had to be some kind of optical illusion, a trick of the fog and poor lighting. But every instinct I had was telling me to run. The figure began climbing again, moving up the crumbling stone steps toward what remained of the bell tower. I followed, though something deep in my gut was warning me not to. When I reached the base of the steps and looked up, the figure was standing at the edge of what used to be the tower platform, maybe 30 feet above the ground. Then it jumped, but instead of falling, it seemed to hang in the air for a moment before slowly descending, its robes flowing upward as if it were underwater. When it touched the ground, it simply faded away like smoke dispersing in the wind. I stood there for several minutes, my heart hammering in my chest, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. I called my wife when I got back to the security office. I needed to talk to someone, to ground myself in something normal and familiar. Maria listened patiently as I told her what happened, and though I could hear the skepticism in her voice, she didn't dismiss me outright. "Maybe it was just someone playing a prank," she suggested. "You know how these rich people are, probably thought it would be funny to scare the new security guard." I wanted to believe that, but the image of that empty hood kept haunting me. The next few nights were worse. I started hearing things, screams echoing from the ruins, the sound of chains dragging across stone, voices speaking in what sounded like Latin prayers. The first few times, I investigated, thinking maybe there were trespassers on the property. But I never found anyone, and the sounds always seemed to be coming from just beyond, where my flashlight could reach. Then I started seeing the woman. She appeared on the fourth night, standing in what used to be the monastery's chapel. The roof had caved in years ago, leaving only the stone walls and empty window frames. She was dressed in black from head to toe, not modern black, but the kind of heavy, formal morning dress women wore in the Victorian era. Her hair was long and white, hanging loose around shoulders that seemed too thin to support her head. She would pace back and forth in front of where the altar used to be, wringing her hands and occasionally looking up at the empty sky through the ruined roof. Sometimes she would fall to her knees as if praying, but her mouth never moved and no sound ever came from her. I learned to avoid that part of the property during my rounds. But the monastery had other plans for me. One night, about a month into the job, I was checking the guest quarters when I heard a child crying. Not the distant echo I'd grown accustomed to, but close, like it was coming from the room right next to me. I followed the sound to a door at the end of the hallway. When I opened it, I found a little boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, sitting in the corner of an empty room. He was wearing clothes that looked like they belonged in an old photograph. Knickers, suspenders, a white shirt with a high collar. "Hey there," I said as gently as I could. "What are you doing here? Where are your parents?" The boy looked up at me with eyes that were far too old for his face. "The man in the brown robe told me to wait here," he said in a voice that sounded like it was coming from very far away. He said someone would come for me soon. I knelt down to his level. "What man? Where did you see him?" The boy pointed toward the window. "He's in the bell tower. He has a rope." I looked toward the ruined tower, and sure enough, I could see a figure standing where I'd seen the monk before. But this figure was different, shorter, wearing brown instead of black, and it was holding something in its hands. Something that looked very much like a rope. When I turned back to ask the boy more questions, he was gone. The room was empty, as if he'd never been there at all. I ran outside, but the figure in the tower had vanished as well. It was then that I started researching the monastery's history. What I found in the local library's archives made my blood run cold. The monks hadn't just executed criminals. They'd taken children too, orphans, runaways, kids whose parents couldn't pay debts. The official records called it providing moral education to wayward youth, but the unofficial accounts painted a much darker picture. One document I found was a letter from a government inspector who'd visited the monastery in 1868. He wrote about finding children as young as 6 working in conditions that amounted to slavery, and described disciplinary chambers where children who disobeyed were locked away for days without food or water. The letter mentioned a brother Marcus, a monk who'd taken a particular interest in the children's spiritual development. Several children had died under his care, always from mysterious accidents or sudden illnesses. The inspector recommended the monastery be shut down immediately, but his report was buried in bureaucratic red tape until it was too late to save more lives. I started having trouble sleeping during the day. Even when I was at home with Maria, I could feel something watching me, waiting. The encounters at the monastery were becoming more frequent and more intense. The woman in black started appearing during every shift, sometimes in the chapel, sometimes wandering the grounds near what used to be the monks' quarters. The child would show up randomly, always asking about the man with the rope, always pointing toward the bell tower. But the worst was Brother Marcus, though I didn't know his name until I found that inspector's letter. He was the monk in the brown robe, and he was always watching me from the shadows, always holding that rope. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of other children following him. A silent procession of the dead following their killer into whatever dark purpose bound them to this place. The breaking point came on a Saturday night in December. I was doing my final rounds before dawn when I heard singing coming from the ruined chapel. Not the ghostly echoes I'd grown used to, but actual voices, clear and beautiful, singing what sounded like a hymn. I approached the chapel carefully and peered through one of the empty window frames. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. The chapel was full of people, dozens of them, maybe more. Men, women, and children, all dressed in clothing from different time periods spanning more than a century. They were translucent, like figures made of moonlight and mist, but their voices were solid and real. At the front of the congregation stood Brother Marcus, no longer trying to hide in shadows. His face was visible now, pale and gaunt, with eyes that burned with fanatic fervor. In his hands was a rope fashioned into a noose. The singing stopped, and Brother Marcus began to speak in Latin. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a sermon about judgment and purification through suffering. As he spoke, the ghostly congregation began to turn toward me. One by one, dozens of dead eyes fixed on mine. The woman in black pointed at me with a finger that was little more than bone. The children began to cry, and Brother Marcus smiled. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, not stopping until I reached my car in the parking lot. I drove home, called in sick for the rest of my shifts that week, and spent the time looking for a new job. I never went back to the monastery. I heard later that they'd had trouble keeping security guards. Apparently, I wasn't the first one to quit suddenly without explanation. The event venue eventually closed down after several high-profile incidents where guests reported supernatural encounters. The property was sold to a developer who planned to build luxury homes. But construction workers kept abandoning the project after equipment malfunctions and unexplained accidents. As far as I know, the monastery grounds still sit empty, waiting for the next person foolish enough to disturb the restless dead who call it home. I've worked security at office buildings and shopping centers. Since then, nice, safe, boring places where the only spirits are the ones people drink at the company Christmas party. But sometimes, on foggy nights when the mist rolls in thick, I still hear that singing in my dreams. And sometimes, I wake up to find muddy footprints leading from my bedroom door to the window, as if someone had been standing there, watching me sleep. I've never seen Brother Marcus again, but I know he's still out there, somewhere in the space between the living and the dead, still holding his rope, still looking for children to save. My name is Paulo, and I spent several months working as a night security guard at a shopping center in Phoenix, Arizona. This happened about 5 years ago, when I was fresh out of college and taking whatever work I could find while looking for something in my field. The Westgate Shopping Center was one of those mid-tier malls that had seen better days. It wasn't quite dead yet, but you could feel it dying slowly. Half the storefronts were empty, and the ones that remained seemed to be hanging on by sheer stubbornness. The place had 2 levels, and maybe 40 stores total, anchored by a department store that probably should have closed years earlier. I worked the overnight shift, 10 p.m. to 8 a.m., 6 nights a week. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady work, and honestly, I needed something that would let me job hunt during the day without having to explain gaps in my employment. On my first night, I met Carlos, the day shift security guard who would be training me for the first week. Carlos was in his 50s, had been working mall security for over a decade, and had that tired look of someone who'd seen too much and cared too little. As we walked through the mall during the shift change, Carlos showed me the basics: how to use the radio system, where the security office was located, which stores had the most sensitive alarm systems. Standard stuff. But then, as we were finishing up the tour, he mentioned something that stuck with me. "Oh, and if you hear voices coming from the 2nd floor, don't worry about it," he said casually, as if he were telling me where to find the coffee machine. "Just ignore them. I used to work nights before I switched to days, and it happens pretty regularly. Other guards have heard it too." I asked him what kind of voices and who they might be. "Nobody knows," he shrugged. "Probably just the building settling, air vents, something like that. But if you go check, you'll never find anybody up there." Learned that the hard way my first few weeks on nights. Nearly gave myself a heart attack running around up there with my flashlight. He warned me that some of the previous night guards had heard screaming and crying coming from the upper level. But that investigating was pointless, because the 2nd floor was always empty after hours. All the stores were locked up tight, and there was no way for anyone to get in without triggering the alarms. I thanked him for the heads up and figured he was just trying to prepare me for the kinds of random noises old buildings make at night. I'd worked security before at a warehouse, and those places made all sorts of weird sounds once everyone went home. Carlos wished me luck and headed out, leaving me alone in the security office with a bank of monitors showing feeds from cameras throughout the mall. Most of the cameras showed nothing but empty corridors and darkened storefronts. Exactly what you'd expect from a closed shopping center at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night. I settled in with a thermos of coffee and a sandwich, ready for what I assumed would be a boring but peaceful night. Around 2 a.m., I heard the voices for the first time. At first, it was just a murmur, the kind of sound that makes you turn down your music and listen more carefully. But as I focused on it, I could tell it was definitely coming from somewhere above me. It sounded like multiple people talking, though I couldn't make out any words. Then the talking became shouting, and the shouting became screaming. I left the security office and stood in the main corridor, looking up at the second-floor balcony that overlooked the central court area. The sounds were definitely coming from up there, and they were unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not anger or fear exactly, but something worse, the sound of people in absolute agony. Despite Carlos's warning, I had to investigate. If someone was hurt up there, I needed to help them. That was part of my job, wasn't it? I took the escalator up to the second level, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The screaming got louder as I climbed, echoing off the walls in a way that made it hard to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. The second floor had a long corridor that ran the length of the building, with stores on both sides. I walked slowly from one end to the other, shining my light into each storefront, checking for any signs of disturbance. Every store was locked tight, their security gates down, no signs that anyone had been there. But the screaming continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I focused on the anchor store at the far end, a department store called Morrison's that took up about a quarter of the second floor's retail space. The sounds seemed loudest when I stood in front of its main entrance, a set of glass doors that were secured with a heavy chain and padlock. I pressed my face to the glass and shone my flashlight inside, scanning the darkened interior. Rows of empty clothing racks cast strange shadows, and the mannequins looked almost human in the dim light. But there was no one there, living or otherwise. After about 20 minutes of searching, the screaming stopped as abruptly as it had started. The mall fell silent again, leaving me standing alone on the second floor with nothing but the hum of the air conditioning system and my own racing heartbeat. I went back to the security office, deeply unsettled, but trying to rationalize what I'd heard. Maybe it was the ventilation system, or pipes expanding and contracting, or sound carrying from outside the building. There had to be a logical explanation. The next day, I mentioned the incident to a friend over lunch. Sarah had lived in Phoenix her whole life, and when I told her which mall I was working at, her expression changed. Wait, Westgate Shopping Center, the one on 43rd Avenue. When I confirmed, she got that look people get when they're about to tell you something terrible. You don't know what happened there, do you? I told her I didn't, and she pulled out her phone, searching for something online. After a few minutes, she showed me a news article from 8 years earlier. The headline read, "Gas explosion at mall restaurant kills 12, injures 23." According to the article, there had been a restaurant on the second floor of the mall called Celebrations, the kind of place that specialized in birthday parties and anniversary dinners. On a busy Saturday night in March, a gas line had ruptured in the kitchen, filling the restaurant with propane fumes. The explosion happened just as the evening rush was beginning. 12 people died instantly, including 4 children who were there for a birthday party. 23 others were hospitalized with severe burns and smoke inhalation. The restaurant was completely destroyed, and several adjacent stores suffered significant damage. The investigation revealed that the gas line had been improperly installed during the restaurant's initial construction, and that several safety inspections had been falsified. The restaurant's owner and the construction company were both charged with criminal negligence, but the families of the victims said no amount of money or jail time could bring back their loved ones. After the explosion, that entire section of the second floor remained empty. The department store I'd been investigating, Morrison's, had moved in 2 years later, taking over the space where Celebrations used to be. I stared at the article, a chill running down my spine. The screaming I'd heard wasn't random noise or building settling. It was the echo of that terrible night, replaying over and over in the place where those people had died in agony. I kept working at the mall for another 3 months, but I never got used to the sounds. Every night at exactly 2 a.m., the screaming would start. Sometimes it lasted 5 minutes, sometimes nearly an hour. I learned to time my rounds to avoid the second floor during those periods, but I could still hear the voices no matter where I was in the building. The sounds weren't just screaming, I realized. If I listened carefully, I could hear other things, people calling for help, children crying for their parents, and underneath it all, a crackling sound like fire consuming everything in its path. Carlos told me that other guards had reported seeing shadows moving inside Morrison's after hours, dark figures wandering between the clothing racks, always disappearing when you looked directly at them. Some of the daytime employees at Morrison's complained about equipment malfunctions, particularly the cash registers, which would occasionally ring up transactions by themselves when no one was operating them. A few Morrison's employees mentioned hearing conversations coming from the store's break room when it was supposed to be empty, and finding the tables rearranged in ways that didn't make sense, like they'd been set up for some kind of party or celebration. I never saw any of the shadows myself, but I believe every word of what those people reported. Some tragedies are too terrible to fade away completely. The pain and terror of what happened in that restaurant 8 years ago had soaked into the very structure of the building, and it was never going away. When I finally found a job in my field and quit the security position, I was relieved to put the Westgate shopping center behind me. But sometimes, when I'm driving past a mall at night and see the darkened storefronts and empty parking lots, I think about those 12 people who just wanted to enjoy a nice dinner out. I think about the birthday party that turned into a nightmare, about the parents who lost children and the children who lost parents, about the split second when celebration became catastrophe. And I wonder if they know that people still hear them, still remember what happened, still feel the echo of their final moments reverberating through the place where they died. The Westgate Shopping Center finally closed permanently last year. The official reason was declining sales and the growth of online shopping. But I think the real truth is that some places become so saturated with tragedy that they can never truly heal. As far as I know, the building still stands empty, waiting for a developer brave enough to tear it down or foolish enough to try to make it into something new. But those voices are still there, trapped in the space between what was and what should have been, screaming into the darkness for someone to hear their story and remember their names. I'm retired now, but I spent 15 years working as a night security guard at Lincoln Elementary School in Salem, Oregon. My name is Martin, and this story takes place during my first month on the job, back when I was still learning the rhythms of the old building and trying to figure out which sounds were normal and which ones meant trouble. Lincoln Elementary was built in 1938, a solid brick building with high ceilings and long hallways that echoed your footsteps no matter how quietly you tried to walk. It was a good school in a decent neighborhood, the kind of place where parents felt comfortable sending their kids and teachers actually enjoyed coming to work. My job was straightforward. Arrive at 10 p.m., do security rounds throughout the night, and make sure everything was locked up and safe for when the students and staff arrived in the morning. During Oregon's rainy season, which lasted about 8 months of the year, I was allowed to take shelter inside the building instead of sitting in the security shed out in the parking lot getting soaked. I usually set up in one of the first floor classrooms near the main entrance, where I could keep an eye on the parking lot and still have access to the building's interior if I needed to investigate anything unusual. The school district had given me keys to every room in the building, along with strict instructions about which areas were off limits to students during the day. Mainly the boiler room and a few storage areas that contained cleaning supplies. On the night this all started, I'd been working at Lincoln for about 3 weeks. I was getting comfortable with the routine and starting to recognize the building's personality. The way the radiators clanked when the heat kicked on, how the wind made different sounds depending on which direction it was coming from, the settling noises that old buildings make as they cool down after a day of activity. It was a Thursday in late November, and the rain was coming down hard enough that I could hear it drumming against the classroom windows. I'd made my first round of the building around 11 p.m., checking doors, testing window locks, making sure the gym and cafeteria were secure. Everything was normal. I settled into Mrs. Patterson's third grade classroom, which had become my usual base of operations. The desks were arranged in neat rows, and the walls were covered with children's artwork and educational posters about the solar system and the water cycle. It was the kind of cheerful, innocent environment that made you feel good about the world. Around midnight, I was reading a paperback novel when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a desk being moved across the floor somewhere above me. Not the gentle scraping you might expect from buildings settling, but the deliberate grinding noise of furniture being dragged from one place to another. I set down my book and listened carefully. The sound came again, definitely a desk or chair being moved around in one of the second-floor classrooms. My first thought was that we had an intruder, maybe a homeless person who'd found a way inside to escape the rain. I grabbed my flashlight and keys and headed upstairs to investigate. The second floor was laid out identically to the first, a long central hallway with classrooms on both sides. I walked slowly down the corridor, listening for any other sounds and checking each door as I passed. When I reached room 208, near the end of the hall, I could tell immediately that something was different. The door was closed, just like all the others, but I could hear movement inside, not footsteps exactly, but the sound of someone shifting around, maybe rearranging furniture. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, hitting the light switch as I entered. The classroom was empty, but one of the student desks had been moved from its usual position in the third row to right in front of the teacher's desk at the front of the room. I knew this wasn't how Mrs. Coleman had left her classroom, because I'd checked this exact room during my 11 p.m. rounds, and everything had been in perfect order. I walked around the classroom, checking the windows to make sure they were still locked, looking for any signs that someone had been there. But there was nothing, no footprints, no disturbed papers, nothing out of place except for that one desk. I pushed the desk back to its original position and left the room, making sure to lock the door behind me. As I walked back toward the stairs, I was already forming explanations in my mind. Maybe the custodial staff had moved it earlier and I just hadn't noticed. Maybe there was something wrong with the building's foundation that caused furniture to shift slightly. But as I reached the stairwell, I felt compelled to look back down the hallway toward room 208. Through the rectangular window in the classroom door, I could see a figure standing inside. It looked like a woman average height, with short dark hair and pale skin. She was wearing what appeared to be a long dark dress or skirt, and she was standing perfectly still, facing the window, looking directly at me. My heart started pounding, but I forced myself to think rationally. This had to be another teacher, someone who'd come back to school for something they'd forgotten, and had gotten locked inside the classroom when I'd left. I hurried back to room 208 and unlocked the door again. The room was empty. I searched everywhere behind the teacher's desk, in the coat closet, even under the tables where the reading groups met. There was nowhere for a person to hide, and the windows were still locked from the inside. But I knew what I'd seen. The atmosphere in that classroom felt wrong somehow, heavy and oppressive, like the air before a thunderstorm. Something was making my skin crawl, an instinctive warning that I needed to get out of there immediately. I left the room and practically ran down the stairs, returning to the safety of Mrs. Patterson's classroom on the first floor. I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, that the combination of darkness, rain, and an overactive imagination had played tricks on me. But I'd barely been sitting down for 5 minutes when I heard it again, furniture being moved around upstairs. But this time, it sounded like multiple pieces being dragged across the floor simultaneously. The noise was chaotic and violent, like someone was throwing desks around in a rage. I knew I should go back up there. It was my job to investigate disturbances and protect school property. But every instinct I had was screaming at me to stay put. The noise continued for several minutes, banging, scraping, what sounded like chairs being overturned. Then it stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving the building in complete silence. I waited about 10 minutes before forcing myself to go back upstairs. When I reached room 208 and looked through the door window, I could see that the classroom was in chaos. Desks had been moved everywhere, some stacked on top of each other, others turned upside down. It looked like a tornado had gone through the room. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, and immediately felt that oppressive atmosphere again, but stronger this time. The air seemed thick and hard to breathe, and I had the overwhelming sensation that I was being watched. As I stood there surveying the damage, trying to figure out how I was going to explain this to the principal, the lights went out. Not just in the classroom, but throughout the entire building. Emergency lighting kicked in a few seconds later, casting everything in a dim red glow that made the overturned furniture look like the aftermath of a violent struggle. In the emergency lighting, I could see her clearly for the first time. She was standing in the corner where the teacher's reading chair usually sat, exactly where I'd thought she might be hiding earlier. But now, I could see that she wasn't hiding. She was just there, existing in that space like she belonged there. She was younger than I'd first thought, maybe in her 30s, with short black hair styled in a way that reminded me of old photographs from the 1940s or 50s. Her dress was dark blue or black, very conservative, with buttons running all the way up to her collar. Her skin was so pale, it was almost luminous in the red emergency lighting. But it was her eyes that made my blood turn to ice. They were filled with an anger so intense it was almost physical, a rage that seemed to have been burning for decades without any way to express itself. She was staring directly at me, and I knew with absolute certainty that she was not among the living. I backed toward the door, not wanting to turn away from her, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip my flashlight. As I reached the threshold, she took a step toward me, and I heard a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. A low, keening wail that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her chest, full of pain and fury and endless, hopeless sorrow. I ran down the hallway, down the stairs, and straight out of the building into the rain. I sat in my car in the parking lot, engine running, heater blasting, trying to process what I'd just experienced. Every rational part of my mind was insisting that I'd had some kind of breakdown, that stress and isolation had caused me to hallucinate. But I knew what I'd seen was real. I stayed in my car until 6 a.m., when the first teachers started arriving for the day. I watched Principal Henderson unlock the building and turn on the lights, and everything looked normal again, just a school preparing for another day of education and childhood laughter. When my shift replacement arrived, I told him I hadn't felt well during the night and had spent most of my time in the parking lot getting some air. I didn't mention anything about room 208 or the woman I'd seen there. But that afternoon, I couldn't resist driving back to the school. I needed to know if the classroom was still destroyed, or if somehow everything had been put back in order. I found Principal Henderson in his office and made up a story about thinking I'd heard someone in the building the night before. I asked if he'd checked the second-floor classrooms to make sure everything was secure. 20 minutes later, he came back with a puzzled expression. "That's odd," he said. "Room 208 is completely torn apart. Desks everywhere, chairs overturned. It looks like someone broke in and vandalized it. But there's no sign of forced entry, and nothing appears to be missing." He asked if I'd noticed anything unusual during my rounds, and I told him I'd check my notes and get back to him. Then I went home and spent the afternoon researching the history of Lincoln Elementary School. What I found explained everything. Her name was Margaret Thornton, and she'd been a teacher at Lincoln Elementary from 1941 until 1953. According to the newspaper archives I found at the public library, she'd been known as a strict disciplinarian who demanded absolute order in her classroom. Parents complained that she was too harsh with the children, that she used physical punishment more frequently and more severely than other teachers. But Margaret Thornton believed she was doing what was best for her students. In her mind, strict discipline would prepare them for the challenges of adult life. She saw herself as saving them from weakness and moral corruption. The end came on a Friday afternoon in May of 1953. A group of 7th grade boys, angry about the way she'd been treating them and their classmates, decided to play a prank that would teach her a lesson. They knew she was terrified of snakes. One of them had seen her reaction when a garden snake had somehow gotten into the school building earlier that year. So they caught a rattlesnake from the hills outside town and hid it in a box in her classroom closet. Their plan was to release it when she opened the closet at the end of the day, giving her a harmless scare that would hopefully make her think twice about being so cruel to her students. But Margaret Thornton had a weak heart, something the boys hadn't known. When the snake came out of the box, striking at her and missing by inches, the shock was too much. She stumbled backward, lost her balance, and fell against the open classroom window. The window was on the 2nd floor, and the fall killed her instantly. The boys were charged with involuntary manslaughter, but because they were minors, they received minimal sentences. The incident was quietly covered up by the school district, which was more concerned about avoiding lawsuits than seeking justice for Margaret Thornton. She was buried in Salem's Hillside Cemetery, and Lincoln Elementary reopened the following Monday with a substitute teacher taking over her classroom. Within a year, most people had forgotten about the stern teacher who died in such a tragic and senseless way. But Margaret Thornton hadn't forgotten. Over the years, there had been numerous reports of strange incidents in room 208. Teachers complained about finding their classrooms rearranged overnight, about feeling watched when they were alone in the building, about cold spots and unexplained sounds. Several teachers had requested transfers to other rooms, and one had quit mid-semester after claiming she'd seen a woman in old-fashioned clothing standing in her classroom after hours. The school district had quietly moved Margaret Thornton's former classroom from active use to storage, then back to active use when enrollment increased, then back to storage again when too many teachers refused to work there. Room 208 was currently being used again because Lincoln Elementary was overcrowded. But Mrs. Coleman, the current occupant, had already put in a request to move to a different room next semester. Armed with this knowledge, I felt a strange mix of fear and sympathy for Margaret Thornton. She'd been a flawed person, maybe even a cruel one, but she hadn't deserved to die the way she did. And now she was trapped in the place where she'd spent 12 years of her life, unable to rest, unable to move on, unable to escape the anger and pain of her final moments. I went back to work that night, but I approached room 208 differently. Instead of avoiding it, I went directly there during my 11 p.m. rounds. The door was closed, but I could sense her presence even before I looked through the window. She was there, standing in the same corner, wearing the same dark dress, radiating the same intense anger. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, my heart pounding but my resolve firm. "Miss Thornton," I said quietly, I know who you are. I know what happened to you." She turned toward me, and for the first time, her expression wasn't pure rage. There was surprise there, and something that might have been relief. "I'm sorry," I continued. "I'm sorry for what those boys did to you, and I'm sorry that no one remembers your name or cares about the injustice of your death. But you don't have to stay angry forever. You don't have to keep reliving that day." She didn't respond. I hadn't expected her to, but the oppressive atmosphere in the room began to lighten slightly. "The children you taught are all grown up now," I told her. "Most of them probably have children and grandchildren of their own. The boys who hurt you served their time and went on with their lives. Staying here, staying angry, isn't punishing them anymore. It's only punishing you." Margaret Thornton looked at me for a long moment, and I could see decades of fury and pain warring with something else. Maybe hope, maybe exhaustion, maybe just the simple desire to finally let go. Then she faded away, not dramatically or suddenly, but gradually, like morning mist burning off in the sunlight. The room felt normal again, just another classroom where children learned and teachers taught, where the future was being shaped one lesson at a time. I never saw Margaret Thornton again, though I worked at Lincoln Elementary for 14 more years. Room 208 never had any more unexplained incidents, and Mrs. Coleman decided not to transfer after all. Sometimes I think about that conversation, about whether I said the right things, or if there was something more I could have done to help her find peace sooner. But mostly, I hope that wherever Margaret Thornton is now, she's found the rest she couldn't find in life. And I hope that somewhere, in whatever comes after this world, she's learned that forgiveness, even for those who hurt us most deeply, is the only way to truly be free. This terrifying experience that nearly cost me my life happened to me and two friends at what we thought was a fast food restaurant, a burger palace, to be specific. Or at least, that's what we believed it to be. My name is James Mitchell, and 3 years ago I went on a camping trip with my two best friends to the remote wilderness areas of northern Montana. We had planned to spend a long weekend hiking and camping near a secluded lake, far from any towns or cities. The area was known for its pristine nature and complete isolation from civilization. It was our second night out there, and we had set up camp about half a mile from the lake. We brought some trail mix and energy bars, but nothing substantial. As evening approached, our stomachs started growling for real food. We were all craving something hot and filling, the kind of meal you can only get at a proper restaurant. We had driven there in my pickup truck, so we decided to explore the winding mountain roads to see if we could find any small towns or truck stops nearby. The area was mostly wilderness, with just the occasional logging road cutting through dense forests of pine and fir trees. After driving for about 45 minutes through increasingly remote terrain, we spotted something unusual in the distance. It looked like a large food truck or mobile diner, sitting in a cleared area just off the main road. But this wasn't like any food truck I'd ever seen. It was enormous, almost the size of a small house on wheels, painted in the familiar red and yellow colors of Burger Palace. The three of us were intrigued. None of us had ever seen a mobile burger palace before, and frankly, we were excited about the novelty of it. Our hunger made the decision easy. We had to check it out. We pulled into the makeshift parking area, which was just a patch of dirt and gravel. There were no other vehicles around, which struck us as odd, but we figured maybe we'd just gotten lucky with the timing. As we approached the entrance, we were greeted by 3 employees, 2 men and 1 woman. They were all wearing the standard Burger Palace uniforms, complete with caps and face masks, even though mask mandates had been lifted everywhere months ago. Their friendliness seemed almost exaggerated, like they were putting on a performance. "Welcome to Burger Palace," the woman called out with an unnaturally bright smile. "Come on in, come on in." The interior was cramped but functional, designed to maximize the limited space of a mobile restaurant. What immediately struck us was that we were the only customers. The place was completely empty except for us and the 3 staff members. My friends Tyler and Marcus seemed excited as we looked over the menu board. Everything appeared normal, the same burgers, fries, and shakes you'd find at any Burger Palace location. We placed our orders, 3 deluxe cheeseburgers with fries and sodas. "Take a seat anywhere you like," one of the male employees said, gesturing toward the small dining area with maybe 6 or 7 tables. We chose a table near the window and started talking about our hiking plans for the next day. That's when Tyler, who was facing toward the counter, suddenly leaned forward and spoke in a low voice. "Don't turn around right now, but that woman behind the counter has been staring at us nonstop since we sat down. She hasn't moved or done anything else, just staring." Marcus laughed and nudged Tyler's shoulder. "Maybe she thinks you're cute, man. You finally got yourself an admirer." But Tyler's expression remained serious. "No, I'm telling you, there's something wrong with the way she's looking at us. It's not normal. She hasn't blinked or looked away even once." I decided to switch seats with Tyler so I could see for myself. When I turned to face the counter, I immediately understood what he meant. The woman was indeed staring at us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Her eyes were fixed on our table, and she stood perfectly still, like a statue. A few minutes later, one of the male employees brought our food over. But instead of simply delivering it and leaving, he just stood there beside our table, not saying anything. The silence stretched on uncomfortably. "Thanks," Marcus said, trying to break the tension. "We're all set here." The employee looked at each of us in turn, his gaze lingering on our faces in a way that felt invasive. Finally, without a word, he walked back to the counter. The 3 of us exchanged worried glances. Something was definitely off about this place. "Let's just eat quickly and get out of here," I whispered. But when we bit into our burgers, we immediately knew something was wrong. The meat tasted awful, spoiled and rancid, nothing like the quality you'd expect from Burger Palace. It was as if the beef had been sitting out in the heat for days. Marcus couldn't hide his disgust. He spit out his first bite and said loudly, "This is disgusting. The meat's gone bad." "Keep your voice down," Tyler hissed, glancing nervously toward the counter where all 3 employees were now standing in a line, watching us. "I'm going to use the bathroom, and then we're getting out of here," Marcus announced, standing up. "I'm not paying for this garbage." He walked toward the back of the mobile diner, where a sign indicated the restrooms. Meanwhile, Tyler and I noticed that 2 of the employees had disappeared from behind the counter, leaving only the woman who had been staring at us. Suddenly, there was a sharp tapping on the window beside our table. We turned to see a young couple outside, frantically gesturing for us to come out. The man was mouthing words we couldn't quite make out, but his expression was one of urgent warning. "Get out of there. The woman with him shouted loud enough for us to hear through the glass. "Get out now." Before we could react, the couple ran away into the darkness, as if something had spooked them. The female employee, who had been behind the counter, was now walking toward our table. Her demeanor had completely changed. The fake friendliness was gone, replaced by something cold and menacing. "Is everything all right with your meal?" she asked, but her tone was threatening rather than concerned. "Actually, we're just going to take it to go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We decided we want to eat by the lake." She stopped beside our table and stared down at us. The smile had vanished from her face entirely, and her eyes held a fury that made my blood run cold. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Without saying another word, she turned and walked away. "We need to get Marcus and leave right now," Tyler whispered urgently. We got up and headed toward the bathroom area to find our friend. But when we pushed open the door marked "Men's Room," we found ourselves in what was clearly not a bathroom at all. Instead, we were in a small, dimly lit storage room with barely enough light to see. There was no toilet, no sink, just empty space and shadows. Tyler immediately tried to open the door we'd just come through, but it wouldn't budge. The handle turned, but the door seemed to be locked or jammed from the outside. "Marcus," I called out, but there was no response. Our friend was nowhere to be seen. I reached for my cell phone to call for help, but when I patted my pockets, I realized it wasn't there. I was certain I'd had it with me when we entered the restaurant, but now it was gone. Tyler checked for his phone too, also missing. We were trapped in this room with no way to communicate with the outside world, and no idea what had happened to Marcus. Then we felt it. The entire structure began to move. The mobile diner was driving away, taking us with it. Tyler started to panic, pounding on the door and shouting for help. I tried to stay calm, knowing that one of us needed to keep a clear head if we were going to get out of this situation alive. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes, the movement stopped. Then we heard a different door open somewhere in the structure, and light began filtering into our makeshift prison from a gap we hadn't noticed before. I grabbed Tyler's arm, and we moved toward the source of the light. What we saw when we peered through that opening will haunt me for the rest of my life. Marcus was there, bound hand and foot with rope, tears streaming down his face. But that wasn't the worst part. Beyond him was a scene straight out of a nightmare, what could only be described as a human butcher shop. Meat hooks hung from the ceiling, stained tables lined the walls, and the smell was absolutely revolting. The odor of death and decay was so overwhelming that I had to fight not to vomit. I quickly untied Marcus, while Tyler stood frozen in shock at the horrific sight around us. "We have to get out of here now," I told them both. That's when we heard footsteps approaching. The 3 employees were coming toward us, but now they looked different. They had removed their caps and masks, revealing faces that were grotesquely deformed like something out of a horror movie. Their features were twisted and scarred, barely human. Each of them was carrying a large knife. "What do you want from us?" I managed to ask, my voice shaking with terror. They didn't respond. Instead, they gestured for us to sit down in a corner of the room. We were too terrified to do anything but comply. One of them grabbed Marcus and forced him onto what looked like a large scale, the kind used in butcher shops to weigh meat. The implication was clear and horrifying. They were planning to process us like livestock, for their mobile restaurant. Marcus was sobbing uncontrollably. I kept telling him to stay calm, that we'd find a way out. But honestly, I had no idea how we were going to survive this. Then we heard the sound of the engine shutting off, and the entire structure stopped moving again. The three deformed individuals left our makeshift prison, and we could hear voices outside, one of them sounding angry and authoritative. "Are you out of your minds?" the voice was shouting. "Someone could have seen you take them. Do you want to get us all caught?" The three employees didn't seem to respond, at least not in any way we could hear. Heavy footsteps approached, and a new figure entered our prison, a massive man, easily 6.5 feet tall, with the same kind of facial deformities as the others, but worse. His appearance was so disturbing that I couldn't look directly at him. "Well, well," he said, looking us over like we were livestock. "I hope your meat is fresher than the last batch." That stuff was starting to turn, and customers were beginning to notice. He gestured towards some of the hanging meat, and I realized with horror that he was talking about other people who had met the same fate we were about to face. Marcus broke down completely, begging and pleading for our lives, promising we wouldn't tell anyone if they let us go. The giant man just laughed, a sound so sinister it made my skin crawl. He left us alone again, and I could hear him talking to his employees outside. This was our chance. "Listen to me," I whispered to my friends. "When that door opens again, we run. We don't hesitate, we don't look back. We just run as fast as we can. It's our only chance." Marcus nodded, wiping his tears. Tyler seemed to snap out of his shock and agreed to the plan. Our luck held when the door opened again. It was the woman who entered first, apparently coming to check on us. We rushed her all at once, knocking her to the ground, and bolted for the exit. We could hear shouting and footsteps behind us as we ran into the night. The mobile diner was parked in a clearing surrounded by dense forest, and there were white objects scattered throughout the area that I realized were bones, human bones. This place was like a graveyard. We ran through the trees, branches tearing at our clothes and faces, until we finally reached the main road. Our pursuers had given up the chase. Maybe they knew better than to follow us into the open where they might be seen. A long-haul trucker eventually stopped for us, and we convinced him to call the police. When the authorities arrived at the location we described, the mobile diner was gone, but they did find the bone-filled clearing and launched a full investigation. We flew back home the next day, too traumatized to continue our camping trip. The case made national news for a while, but as far as I know, they never caught the people responsible. The thought that still keeps me awake at night is that mobile diner could be anywhere now, parked at a rest stop, a county fair, or alongside some remote highway, serving its horrific fare to unsuspecting customers and looking for its next victims. My name is Sarah Chen, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me 5 years ago when I was working the overnight shift at a 24-hour diner in a small town outside Phoenix, Arizona. I was putting myself through college at the time, and the night shift paid better than day shifts, even though it meant dealing with fewer customers and more unusual situations. The diner was called Mel's All-Night Cafe, and it was one of those classic American diners with red vinyl booths, checkered floors, and neon signs in the windows. During the day, it was busy with truckers, travelers, and locals, but after midnight, things got pretty quiet. Usually it was just me and two other employees working the overnight shift. Kevin, who handled the kitchen, and Maria, who helped with customers and cleaning. The incident I'm going to tell you about happened on a Wednesday night in late October. It was one of those desert nights where the temperature had dropped significantly after a blazing hot day, and there was an eerie stillness in the air that made everything feel unsettled. Kevin was in the back doing dishes and cleaning the kitchen equipment when this man walked in around 2:30 in the morning. He was dressed entirely in black, an expensive-looking suit, polished shoes, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows over most of his face. What struck me immediately was his height. He had to be at least 6'5", maybe taller. In a small town like ours, someone that tall and well-dressed would normally stand out. But there was something about him that was unsettling rather than impressive. Instead of approaching the counter to order, he walked directly to a corner booth in the back of the restaurant, as far from the front windows as possible. He sat down with his back to us and just stayed there, perfectly still. Maria and I exchanged glances. We were used to dealing with odd customers during the night shift, insomniacs, people coming off long drives, folks who'd had too much to drink, but this felt different. "Should we go take his order?" Maria whispered to me. "Let's give him a minute to settle in," I replied, though something in my gut was telling me to be cautious. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. The man hadn't moved at all. He wasn't looking at a menu, checking his phone, or doing anything that suggested he was planning to order food. He just sat there, motionless. "This is weird," Maria said. "We can't just let him sit there without ordering anything. What if he's waiting for us to come over?" But I was reluctant to approach him. There was something about his presence that made the hair on my arms stand up. Instead, I suggested we ask Kevin to handle it, since he was a guy and might feel more comfortable dealing with a potentially difficult customer. Kevin wasn't thrilled about the idea, but he agreed to go talk to the man. As he approached the booth, the stranger suddenly stood up and walked toward the back exit of the diner without saying a word or even acknowledging Kevin's presence. Kevin turned back to us with a confused expression. That was strange. He left before I could even say anything. We laughed it off and went back to our closing duties. I was wiping down tables near the front windows when I happened to glance outside and froze. The tall man in the black suit was standing in the parking lot beside my car, but he wasn't looking at the vehicle. He was staring directly at the diner windows, directly at me. Even though I couldn't make out his facial features in the darkness, I could feel the intensity of his gaze. I quickly stepped away from the window and called Kevin and Maria over. "He's outside," I told them, standing by my car, watching the restaurant. They both rushed to look, but by the time they got to the window, the parking lot appeared empty. "Are you sure you saw someone?" Maria asked. "Maybe it was just shadows from the streetlights." I was certain of what I'd seen, but I started to doubt myself when they couldn't confirm it. About 20 minutes later, Kevin went outside to empty the trash into the dumpster behind the building. He came back inside much faster than usual, looking visibly shaken. "He's out there," Kevin said, breathing heavily. "The guy in the black suit. He was hiding behind the dumpster, watching me the whole time I was taking out the garbage. When I saw him, he didn't run or try to hide better. He just kept staring at me." Now we were all concerned. We went to the small office in the back where the security monitors were located. The diner had 4 cameras, one covering the front entrance, one for the dining area, one for the back door, and one that could be adjusted to cover different parts of the parking lot. We scanned through the feeds, but initially we couldn't see the man anywhere. Then Kevin adjusted the angle on the exterior camera, tilting it downward, and we saw something that made our blood run cold. There at the very bottom edge of the frame was the brim of a black hat. The man was standing directly beneath the office window, just out of the camera's normal range, looking up at us. We spun around to look at the actual window, but no one was there. Yet when we looked back at the monitor, the hat was still visible in the frame. "How is that possible?" Maria whispered. "If he's not at the window, why is he showing up on camera?" That's when I decided we needed to call the police. This had gone beyond just a strange customer. We were dealing with someone who was clearly stalking us, and his behavior was escalating. The police arrived within 15 minutes. 2 officers took our statement and searched the entire area around the diner, including the parking lot, the dumpster area, and the vacant lot across the street. They found no trace of the man in the black suit. The officers asked us to make copies of the security footage, which Kevin provided on a flash drive. They assured us they would patrol the area more frequently for the rest of the night, and told us to call 911 immediately if the man returned. After the police left, the remainder of our shift passed without incident. The morning crew arrived at 7 a.m., and as usual, I stayed behind for a few minutes to brief them on the night's events and hand over any notes about inventory or maintenance issues. I was alone in the diner, finishing up my coffee and waiting for the day manager to arrive, when I heard sounds coming from the men's restroom. At first, I thought maybe one of the morning crew had gone in there. But when I checked, everyone was accounted for and working in other parts of the restaurant. The sounds continued footsteps pacing back and forth inside the bathroom. "Hello," I called out, hoping it was just a customer who had come in without me noticing. No response. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then resumed. I grabbed my purse and jacket and headed for the exit. I wasn't about to investigate those sounds alone. As I was leaving, I met Dave, the morning shift supervisor, who was just arriving. I quickly explained what was happening, and Dave agreed to check it out with me. We went back inside together, and he approached the men's room cautiously. "Anybody in there?" he called out, knocking on the door silence. He pushed the door open slowly, and we both peered inside. The bathroom was completely empty. I was thoroughly spooked by this point. I got in my car and drove home as quickly as I could, just wanting to put some distance between myself and whatever was happening at that diner. The next evening when I came in for my shift, Dave told me that a package had been delivered for me during the day, which was odd because no one ever sent packages to my workplace. "It was just sitting by the back door when I got here this morning," he said. "No delivery truck, no signature required. Someone must have dropped it off." The package was small, about the size of a shoebox, wrapped in plain brown paper. My name was written on it in block letters, but there was no return address or shipping label. I took it to the break room to open it, thinking maybe it was from a friend or family member who knew I worked there. But when I lifted the lid, I nearly screamed. Inside the box was a black fedora hat, the same style worn by the man who had been stalking us the night before. There was no note, no explanation, Nothing else in the box except the hat. I immediately showed it to Kevin and Maria, who were just as disturbed as I was. We all recognized it as identical to what the stranger had been wearing. "This has to be some kind of sick joke," Maria said, but her voice betrayed her fear. I was about to throw the hat in the trash when Officer Martinez, one of the policemen from the previous night, walked into the diner. He had come to follow up on our complaint and let us know what they'd found on the security footage. "I need to speak with you about what happened last night," he said to me. "We've analyzed the video recordings you gave us, and there are some things you need to know." We sat down in a booth, and Officer Martinez pulled out a notebook. "The man you described, the tall man in the black suit and hat, he's someone we've been tracking for the past 3 years. His name was Vincent Crowley, and he was a suspected serial killer who had been targeting young women who worked night shifts at restaurants and gas stations throughout Arizona and New Mexico." My heart started racing. 2 nights ago, during a routine traffic stop about 50 miles from here, Crowley tried to flee from police. He crashed his vehicle and was killed in the accident. The thing is, according to our timeline, he died several hours before you claim to have seen him here. I stared at the officer in disbelief. "That's impossible. We all saw him. He was here." "I believe you saw something," Officer Martinez said carefully. "But Vincent Crowley was already dead when you encountered whoever was outside your restaurant." I showed him the hat that had been delivered, and his expression changed immediately. "Where did you get this?" he asked, examining it closely. "Someone left it for me today. No return address, no delivery information." Officer Martinez held the hat up to the light, and that's when I noticed something I had missed before. There was a small hole in the side of the hat, and what looked like a dark stain around it. "This hat was part of the evidence from Crowley's death scene," the officer said grimly. "He was wearing it when he was shot by police. See this hole? That's from the bullet." I felt like I was going to be sick. How is that possible? How could his hat be delivered to me if it's evidence in a police case? "It shouldn't be possible," Officer Martinez admitted. "This hat should be locked up in our evidence room. I'm going to have to take this with me and find out how it ended up here." The investigation that followed revealed that the hat was indeed the same one Vincent Crowley had been wearing when he died, confirmed through DNA evidence found on the inside band. But there was no explanation for how it had gotten from the police evidence locker to my workplace. The security footage from the diner was analyzed by experts, but they couldn't explain the anomalies we had witnessed. How the man appeared on camera but not in person, how he seemed to be in 2 places at once. I transferred to the day shift after that incident. I couldn't handle working nights anymore, knowing that Crowley had been stalking me for days before his death, planning whatever terrible things he had in mind. The police found evidence in his apartment that he had been watching several night shift workers in the area, and I was apparently next on his list. But here's what still haunts me. Even though Vincent Crowley died before we encountered him that night, someone or something delivered his hat to me the next day. Someone or something wanted to finish what he had started. I moved to a different state 6 months later, but I still have nightmares about that tall figure in black, standing in the shadows, watching and waiting. Sometimes I wonder if some obsessions are so strong that they survive even death, and if Vincent Crowley is still out there somewhere, looking for me. My name is Martin, and I'm a retired security guard from Lincoln Elementary School in Portland, Oregon. What I'm about to tell you happened during my first month on the night shift, back in the winter of 2008. I was still getting used to the routine of watching over the empty school building through those long, cold nights. The school was built in 1942, a brick structure with 2 floors, and that distinctive smell of old wood and chalk that seems to seep into the walls of every elementary school. My job was simple enough. Arrive at 10 p.m., lock myself in, do 2 security rounds throughout the night, and make sure nothing was disturbed until the staff arrived in the morning. On particularly cold nights like this one, I was allowed to take shelter in one of the ground floor classrooms rather than sitting outside on the bench in the courtyard. The heating system was old and uneven, leaving some parts of the building freezing while others remained tolerably warm. I remember arriving that Tuesday night to find a bitter wind cutting through the trees surrounding the school. After completing my first round and confirming everything was secure, I unlocked classroom 104 and settled into a student chair, pulling my jacket tight around me. The desk was too small for my frame, but it beat standing outside in the cold. I must have been dozing for about 20 minutes when a loud screech jolted me awake. It was the unmistakable sound of a desk being dragged across the floor upstairs. The metal legs grinding against the linoleum created that particular fingernails on chalkboard noise that every school maintenance worker knows too well. My first thought was that some homeless person had broken in through an upstairs window, seeking shelter from the cold. It wouldn't have been the first time. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the stairwell, taking the steps 2 at a time. Classroom 212 was where the sound had come from. I tried the handle and found it unlocked, which immediately put me on edge since I always secured every door during my initial sweep. As I pushed it open and flicked on the fluorescent lights, I saw that one of the student desks had been moved from its position in the 3rd row to right in front of the teacher's desk. This struck me as odd because I distinctly remembered that particular classroom being perfectly arranged when I'd checked it earlier. Every desk in neat rows, just as the teacher had left them. I dragged the desk back to its proper position, checked the windows for any signs of forced entry, found nothing, and headed back downstairs. I was just about to re-enter my temporary shelter when something made me look up at the 2nd floor windows. That's when I saw her. A woman's silhouette in the window of classroom 212, the very room I'd just left. She appeared to be watching me, her face pressed close to the glass. She had short, dark hair and appeared to be wearing something light-colored, though I couldn't make out details from that distance. What I could see clearly was how unnaturally pale her skin looked against the dark window frame. The sight of her standing there, perfectly still, sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. I knew I had to investigate. That was my job, after all, regardless of how much the situation unnerved me. I raced back up the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. But when I burst through the classroom door, she was gone. The room was empty, the fluorescent lights still humming overhead, casting harsh shadows across the rows of small desks. But something felt wrong, deeply wrong. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and can sense that the atmosphere is charged with something unpleasant. The air felt thick and oppressive, like walking into a pocket of cold, stagnant water. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave. So I did. I practically ran back to the ground floor and locked myself in the classroom, my heart pounding. But I'd barely caught my breath when the sound started again. This time, it wasn't just one desk being moved. It sounded like furniture was being thrown around, desks slamming against walls and each other with tremendous force. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate clicks across the floor above me, like someone wearing hard-soled shoes or high heels. The sound was rhythmic, purposeful, as if whoever was up there was pacing back and forth across the length of the classroom. I sat there for several minutes, listening to this impossible symphony of furniture being destroyed and footsteps marking time across the ceiling. Finally, I forced myself to stand up. They were paying me to protect this place, and I couldn't do that cowering in a first-grade classroom. The second trip upstairs was slower, more cautious. I called out as I climbed, asking if anyone was there, but my voice just echoed back at me from the empty hallways. The footsteps had stopped the moment I'd left the classroom below. As I approached room 212, I could see that the door was standing wide open, though I was certain I'd closed it behind me during my hasty retreat. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, reaching for the light switch. The classroom was in chaos. Every single desk had been overturned or pushed out of place. Some were stacked on top of each other in impossible configurations. Others lay on their sides, creating a maze of metal and plastic that made it difficult to navigate the room. It looked like a tornado had torn through the space. I spent the next 15 minutes righting each desk and returning them to their proper positions. My hands were shaking as I worked, and I kept glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see that pale face watching me from outside. When I finished, the room looked normal again, exactly as it should. I walked to the door and reached for the light switch, but as the fluorescent bulbs flickered off, I saw her. Clear as day, sitting in the teacher's chair behind the desk. The same woman I'd seen in the window, wearing what appeared to be a long black dress with buttons running up to her neck. Her short dark hair framed a face, so pale it seemed to glow in the darkness. She was looking directly at me, and when our eyes met, her lips curved into what might have been a smile. It was the most terrifying expression I'd ever seen on a human face. I ran. I don't think I've ever moved so fast in my life. I took those stairs 3 at a time and slammed the classroom door behind me, turning the lock with trembling fingers. My shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cold, and I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. For the next hour, I sat in that chair and prayed. I'm not an especially religious man, but that night I found myself reciting every prayer I could remember from childhood. The sounds continued above me. More furniture being moved, those deliberate footsteps, and occasionally what sounded like someone walking down the hallway. Around 4 a.m., I watched a shadow pass by the windows of my classroom. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if someone was walking along the covered walkway that connected the buildings. But when I pressed my face to the glass to get a better look, the shadow simply dissolved, like smoke dissipating in the wind. I remained locked in that room until sunrise, when I heard the familiar sounds of cars pulling into the parking lot and keys jingling as the morning staff arrived. By 6:30, the building was alive with the chatter of teachers preparing for the day. Mrs. Henderson, the 3rd-grade teacher I'd become friendly with over my few weeks on the job, took one look at me and started laughing. She said I looked like I'd seen a ghost, which under the circumstances was uncomfortably accurate. I must have looked terrible because her expression quickly changed from amusement to concern. I found myself telling her everything that had happened. I needed to tell someone, and she'd always seemed like a sensible person. When I finished, I added that I was seriously considering quitting. I couldn't face another night like that one. Mrs. Henderson's reaction surprised me. Instead of dismissing my story or suggesting I'd been dreaming, she nodded thoughtfully and told me not to resign. She said she'd heard rumors about the woman I'd described, though she'd never seen her personally. According to the stories that circulated among the long-term staff, the woman had been a teacher at Lincoln Elementary back when it first opened in the 1940s. By all accounts, she'd been a cruel woman who seemed to take pleasure in punishing children. This was back when corporal punishment was not only allowed, but expected, and she apparently used that authority to its fullest extent. The story went that a group of 8th grade students had finally decided they'd had enough of her treatment. They planned an elaborate revenge that involved capturing a snake from the hills outside of town and hiding in classroom 212, waiting for her to arrive for her afternoon class. When she walked through the door, they dropped the snake onto her shoulders. She panicked, stumbling backwards so violently that she fell over the second-floor railing. The fall killed her instantly when she landed headfirst on the concrete below. Mrs. Henderson told me that several maintenance workers and substitute teachers had reported seeing the woman over the years, always in that same classroom. Most quit within days of their encounters, but she convinced me to stay, pointing out that the woman was dead and couldn't actually harm me. I took her advice and remained at Lincoln Elementary for 12 more years. The sounds continued occasionally, always around the same time of night, always from classroom 212. But I never saw her again. I learned to simply stay on the ground floor when things got active upstairs, and eventually the fear faded to a manageable unease. Some nights were worse than others. Sometimes I'd hear what sounded like children crying or desks being arranged and rearranged for hours. But I never went back up to investigate. Some mysteries are better left alone. I retired last spring, and they've hired a younger man to take over the night shift. I wonder if Mrs. Henderson will have the same conversation with him that she had with me. I hope he's braver than I was, or perhaps wiser in knowing when not to be brave at all. The new security guard seems like a nice enough fellow. I just hope he's prepared for what he might encounter during those long winter nights when the school is empty and the past refuses to stay buried. Some places hold onto their tragedies, and Lincoln Elementary is one of them. My name is Eric, and I used to work as a night security guard at the Riverside County Morgue in California. This happened about 5 years ago, and I still get chills thinking about it. My friend Tony got me the job since he worked there as a custodian, and honestly, it seemed like easy money at the time. I've always believed that the living are far more dangerous than the dead, so the idea of spending my nights watching over a morgue didn't particularly bother me. The pay was decent, and the only downside was working the overnight shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. I wasn't used to nocturnal work, but I needed the employment, so I accepted without hesitation. The facility was a modern, single-story building constructed in the early 2000s, all concrete and steel, with that sterile, institutional feel you'd expect. My job was straightforward: patrol the exterior perimeter, monitor the security cameras from a small guardhouse near the main entrance, and ensure no one tried to break in. Most nights, there were forensic pathologists working inside, so I rarely had to enter the building itself. Everything went smoothly for my first 3 weeks. The work was routine, almost boring. I'd make my rounds every 2 hours, check the parking lot for any suspicious activity, and spend the rest of the time reading magazines or watching security footage of empty hallways and parking lots. But on Thursday night, October 15th, Dr. Patterson called me from home around 1:30 in the morning. He was in a panic because he'd been trying to reach me on the main office line for 20 minutes with no answer. He explained that he thought he'd left his cell phone in the reception area after finishing some paperwork earlier that evening. Dr. Patterson was one of the more considerate doctors who worked there, always polite and professional, so I was happy to help. I told him I'd check for the phone and call him back. I locked up the guardhouse and made my way to the main entrance, using my master key to get inside. The reception area was dimly lit by a single emergency light, casting long shadows across the waiting room furniture and reception desk. I clicked on my flashlight and began searching the area where Dr. Patterson typically worked. Sure enough, his phone was sitting right there on the desk, partially hidden beneath a stack of forms. I picked up the device and was about to head back outside to call him when I heard something that made my blood run cold. From somewhere deep in the building, a voice called my name. Not shouted, but whispered in a way that somehow carried down the long corridor. Eric, Eric. The sound seemed to drift from the direction of the examination rooms, barely audible but unmistakably clear. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and called out, "Who's there?" But the building remained silent, as if it were holding its breath. My immediate thought was that someone had broken in, possibly a vagrant seeking shelter, or maybe someone with more sinister intentions. Part of my job was to investigate any potential security breaches, even though I wasn't armed and had only my radio for backup. I stood there for several long moments, listening intently, but heard nothing more. Still, I knew I had to investigate. I started down the main hallway, moving slowly and keeping my radio ready in case I needed to call for help. My footsteps echoed off the hard floors despite my efforts to move quietly. As I approached the area where the forensic examinations took place, I noticed that light was spilling out from under the door of the main autopsy suite. This seemed unusual, though I wasn't entirely familiar with the protocol for how the facility should be left at night. Dr. Patterson might have simply forgotten to turn off the lights when he finished his work. But then I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A shadow moved across the strip of light beneath the door. Someone was definitely inside that room, walking slowly back and forth in front of the door. The silhouette was clearly human, but something about the way it moved seemed off, too deliberate and measured. I knew for certain that all staff members had to sign out with me before leaving the building. It was a strict security protocol, and I had the log sheet with me. According to my records, Dr. Patterson had been the last person to leave, and that was at 6:15 p.m. No one should have been in there. I was working up the courage to push through those doors and confront whoever was inside when the phone in reception started ringing. I jogged back down the hallway to answer it and found Dr. Patterson on the line again. He was worried because he'd been trying to reach me at the guardhouse, and when I didn't answer, he'd called the main number. I apologized and explained what was happening. Dr. Patterson immediately became concerned, telling me that he distinctly remembered turning off all the lights in his work area before leaving, just as he always did. He couldn't understand why the autopsy suite would be illuminated, and the idea that someone might be inside was deeply troubling since those doors were supposed to be locked, with the key secured in a coded locker. He instructed me to call the police immediately and said he was driving over to collect his phone and see what was happening. I was about to dial 911 when something made me hesitate. I felt compelled to verify that there really was an intruder before bringing the authorities into it. I made my way back toward the autopsy suite, moving as quietly as possible. The light was still on, but I could no longer see any movement beneath the door. When I gently pushed against it, it swung open easily, despite Dr. Patterson's assurance that it had been locked. I aimed my flashlight into the room and slowly scanned from corner to corner. The autopsy suite was a large, sterile space with 6 examination tables arranged in 2 rows. Each table held a body covered with a white sheet, exactly as they should be. Everything appeared normal and undisturbed, but the atmosphere in that room felt incredibly heavy and oppressive, like walking into a wall of cold, thick air. It was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave immediately. I didn't want to enter the room fully, so I remained in the doorway, sweeping my flashlight beam methodically across the space. That's when I saw it. One of the covered bodies was sitting upright on its table, still draped with the white sheet, but clearly in a sitting position rather than lying flat. The sight was so shocking and impossible that I dropped my flashlight, and the room plunged into darkness. I scrambled to retrieve the light, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it. As I backed out of the room, I heard Dr. Patterson's voice calling from the main entrance. He'd arrived just as I was fleeing the autopsy suite, and the relief I felt at hearing another human voice was overwhelming. When he saw the state I was in, pale and trembling, he immediately asked what had happened and whether I'd confirmed there was an intruder. I told him everything I'd experienced, and he listened with a grave expression before asking if I'd called the police yet. I admitted that I hadn't, wanting to be certain of what I'd seen first. Without saying another word, Dr. Patterson headed straight for the autopsy suite. I followed reluctantly, not wanting to be alone, but dreading what we might find. He flipped on the overhead lights, and I braced myself for what I was about to see. The room looked completely normal. Every body was lying flat on its table, properly covered and positioned. Dr. Patterson walked slowly between the tables, checking each one, before turning to me and asking which body I'd seen sitting up. I pointed to the table in the far corner, and he approached it carefully. When he pulled back the sheet, I saw the body of a young man, probably in his early 20s, with visible signs of trauma that I won't describe in detail out of respect for the deceased. Dr. Patterson's expression grew somber as he looked at the body. He told me that this particular case had been weighing heavily on everyone in the department. The young man had been held captive for over a month before his family paid a ransom demand. Despite their compliance, their son had been returned to them in this condition. What disturbed Dr. Patterson even more was that ever since this body had arrived at the morgue 3 days earlier, Several staff members had reported strange sounds coming from the autopsy suite when no one was supposed to be inside. He dismissed these reports as imagination or nerves, but now he was beginning to reconsider. He looked at me with a serious expression and said that while it might sound impossible, this wasn't the first time he'd encountered something like this. In his 15 years working as a forensic pathologist, he'd noticed that bodies of people who had suffered particularly traumatic deaths sometimes seemed to resist their final rest. As he was speaking, I suddenly remembered that I'd called the police before going to investigate. Sure enough, we heard sirens approaching the building. I ran outside to meet the officers and explain the situation, feeling somewhat foolish, but knowing I had to follow through. The police conducted a thorough search of the facility, but found no evidence of any intruder. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints where there shouldn't be any, and nothing missing or disturbed. They were professional and understanding, but I could tell they thought I'd been seeing things. After the officers left, Dr. Patterson collected his phone and asked me to keep what had happened between us. He didn't want to alarm the other staff members unnecessarily. Before leaving, he suggested I review the security camera footage to see if I could find any rational explanation for what I'd experienced. I spent the remaining hours of my shift going through the video recordings from every camera in the building. The footage clearly showed me entering and leaving the facility, Dr. Patterson arriving and departing, and the police conducting their search. But at no point did any camera capture another person entering or leaving the morgue. I wanted desperately to find a logical explanation for what had happened, but there simply wasn't one. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that I'd witnessed something beyond normal experience. The next day, I started looking for a new job. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been called by name by someone who needed help, someone who couldn't rest peacefully. The idea that I might have to face another night like that one was more than I could handle. I worked one more week while they found a replacement, and then I submitted my resignation. I still have nightmares about that night sometimes, and I've never been able to fully understand what happened in that autopsy suite. What I do know is that some deaths are so traumatic, so filled with suffering, that they leave an imprint on the world of the living. That young man had endured weeks of torment before his life was taken, and perhaps some part of him was still trapped in that experience, unable to find peace. I hope whoever took my place at the morgue is better prepared for the unexplained than I was. Some jobs require more courage than others, and working alone with the dead in the middle of the night definitely falls into that category. I can't reveal my real name for this story because I'm still concerned about my safety, even after all these years. What I'm about to tell you happened in Chicago, Illinois, when I was working as a night security guard for a small office building in the downtown area. The building was only 5 stories tall, built in the 1970s, and owned by a wealthy businessman who rented out office space to various companies. He was rarely seen around the property, preferring to manage things remotely, which should have been my first red flag. My job was simple enough. Work the overnight shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., monitor the security cameras from the reception desk in the lobby, and respond to any issues that might arise. The pay was decent for what seemed like easy work, and I needed the income. When they hired me, the building manager, Mr. Rodriguez, gave me very specific instructions. I was never, under any circumstances, to go to the 5th floor. He explained that it was unfinished space that wasn't safe for occupancy, and only the owner had access to that level. I was given keys to every other floor, but none for the 5th. For the first 2 weeks, everything went smoothly. The building housed a law firm, an accounting office, a small marketing agency, and a dental practice. During the day, it was a normal, busy office building. At night, it was quiet and peaceful, exactly what you'd expect. But on Tuesday night, November 8th, while I was in the lobby playing games on my phone to pass the time, I heard loud banging sounds coming from above me. The noise was coming from the 5th floor, where no one was supposed to be. I sat there for several minutes, trying to decide what to do. The banging was getting louder and more insistent, as if someone was hitting the walls or floor with something heavy. Finally, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Against my explicit instructions, I decided to investigate. I took the elevator to the 5th floor for the first time since starting the job. When the doors opened, I found myself looking down a long, dimly lit hallway with a single door at the far end. The banging was definitely coming from behind that door, and it was much louder up here. As I approached the door, I could see that it wasn't just locked with a regular deadbolt. There were 2 heavy-duty padlocks securing it from the outside, which struck me as extremely odd. Why would you need to lock something from the outside, unless you were trying to keep something or someone inside? I tried the handle anyway, but of course, it wouldn't budge. The banging continued, becoming more frantic as I stood there. That's when my radio crackled to life. It was Mr. Rodriguez, and he sounded furious. He demanded to know why I was on the 5th floor, saying that the building owner had been watching me on the security cameras and was extremely angry about my unauthorized presence there. I apologized and explained about the noise, but Mr. Rodriguez cut me off, telling me to get back to my post immediately if I wanted to keep my job. He reminded me that I'd been specifically warned about the 5th floor and said there was a reason for that restriction. I apologized again and returned to the lobby, but I couldn't stop thinking about those desperate-sounding bangs and the padlocks on the outside of the door. 3 days passed, and I tried to focus on my regular duties, but the questions kept nagging at me. What was behind that door? Why was it locked from the outside? And why did the owner monitor the building so closely at night? On Friday night, the banging started again around 2 a.m. This time it was even more violent and urgent than before. I couldn't ignore it, knowing that someone might genuinely need help up there. Despite the risk to my job, I made the decision to investigate again. I took the elevator back to the 5th floor, and as I approached the door, the banging became almost frantic. I knocked twice on the door and called out, asking if anyone was there. In response, the banging became even more desperate. I told whoever was inside to knock twice if they needed help, and immediately heard 2 distinct knocks in response. My heart was racing as I realized that someone was definitely trapped behind that door, and I had to act quickly before the owner spotted me on the cameras again. I rushed back to the lobby, grabbed a hammer from the maintenance closet, and returned to the 5th floor. Working as fast as I could, I attacked the padlocks and door frame with everything I had. The metal was thick and strong, but desperation gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. When I finally managed to break through and swing the door open. What I saw inside will haunt me for the rest of my life. A man was lying on the floor near the door, his hands and feet bound with duct tape covering his mouth. He was the source of the banging, using his feet to kick against the door. But that wasn't the worst of it. Around the room, I saw what can only be described as a chamber of horrors. Human bodies were displayed in glass cases like mannequins in a store window. There was a large industrial freezer against one wall, and I didn't want to imagine what was inside it. For several seconds, I couldn't move. The scene was so shocking, so beyond anything I'd ever imagined, that my mind couldn't process it. Then training kicked in, and I rushed to help the bound man, removing the tape from his mouth and working to untie his restraints. He was crying and begging me to help him escape as quickly as possible. When I asked who had done this to him, he told me the building owner's name, which I won't repeat here for obvious reasons. He explained that he'd been brought here under the pretense of a business meeting. But something had gone wrong, and he'd been held captive for 3 days. The man told me that the owner was planning to kill him and add him to his collection, just as he'd done with all the others. He called the owner a complete psychopath who experimented on his victims before preserving their bodies. I wanted to call the police immediately, but I'd left my cell phone back at the reception desk and only had my radio, which connected me directly to Mr. Rodriguez. I no longer trusted him and suspected he might be involved in whatever was happening here. I was still working to free the man's hands when all the lights in the building suddenly went out. The victim immediately started crying harder, saying he was certain the owner had caused the power outage and was coming for us. We had no choice but to try to escape in the darkness. The man was weak and could barely walk after being bound for days, so our progress was painfully slow. We couldn't use the elevator without power, which meant we had to make our way to the stairwell and try to reach the ground floor. I turned on my flashlight, and we began moving down the hallway toward the emergency exit. We'd barely made it halfway when we heard someone enter the stairwell from below and start climbing toward us. Heavy footsteps echoed in the concrete stairway, and I knew we were trapped. The victim was trembling and whispering that we needed to hide, that the owner would kill us both if he found us. But there was nowhere to go on the 5th floor since all the other spaces were locked, and we couldn't go up any higher. We had no choice but to retreat back to the room where I'd found him. I helped him inside and pushed a desk against the door, though I knew it wouldn't hold for long. I gripped the hammer tightly, knowing it was our only weapon. The owner started pounding on the door, his voice calm and cold as he told us there was nowhere to run. He forced his way past the desk, and when he came at me, I was ready to defend myself, but he was much stronger than I'd expected. His large hands wrapped around my throat, and I felt consciousness slipping away when the victim managed to grab the hammer and strike the owner in the head. The man collapsed, unconscious but still breathing. We ran down the stairs as fast as we could manage, and I grabbed my phone from the reception desk to call 911. The emergency responders arrived within minutes and immediately secured the scene as a crime site. When they searched the 5th floor, they found evidence of multiple murders. All those bodies in the glass cases had been victims of this man's sick experiments. He's now serving multiple life sentences in a maximum security prison, though I still sometimes wake up in cold sweats, worried that he might somehow escape and come looking for me. The building has since been demolished, and the lot remains empty. I moved to a different state shortly after testifying at the trial, and I'm still trying to process what I experienced that night. I've never taken another security job, and I probably never will. Some experiences change you fundamentally, and discovering that level of human evil is definitely one of them. I just hope that all of his victims have finally found the peace that was stolen from them in life. My name is David, and I want to share an experience that happened to me about 3 years ago when I was working as a night security guard at a large warehouse facility outside of Sacramento, California. The job didn't last very long, and after you hear what happened, you'll understand why. I'd worked as a security guard for several years at various locations around the city, mostly at schools and small office buildings. So when this opportunity came up, I thought it would be more of the same. The pay was decent, and I needed the work, even though my wife wasn't thrilled about the location. The warehouse was situated on Highway 91, about 20 miles outside the city limits, in an area known for gang activity and occasional violence. It was pretty isolated out there, surrounded by nothing but farmland and a few scattered houses. My wife worried about me being so far from help if something went wrong, but I assured her I'd be safely locked inside the building all night. The facility itself was enormous, more like an aircraft hangar than a typical warehouse. It had a corrugated metal roof and concrete floors, and during the winter months when I started working there, it was absolutely freezing inside. The heating system was inadequate for such a large space, and I often had to wear my heavy coat even indoors. For the first few weeks, everything was routine. I'd arrive at 11 p.m., do my rounds through the vast empty space, and spend the rest of the night monitoring the security cameras and staying warm. It was boring work, but I dealt with worse. Then came that Saturday night in January when everything changed. I was making my usual patrol around 9:30 in the evening when I heard distinct footsteps on the metal roof above me. The sound was clear and deliberate, like someone walking slowly across the corrugated surface. This seemed impossible because the roof was at least 30 feet high, and I couldn't imagine how anyone could have climbed up there. I went outside to investigate, but from ground level, I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The exterior lights only illuminated a small area around the building, and the roof extended far beyond their reach. I called out, asking who was up there, but received no response. Since there wasn't much I could do about it, I went back inside and tried to forget about it. But around 5 a.m., I heard what sounded like people screaming from somewhere inside the warehouse. I searched every corner of the massive space, checking behind stacks of stored equipment and in every shadowy corner, but found nothing. The screaming had sounded desperate and terrifying, like people in genuine distress, but the warehouse was completely empty except for me. I left work that morning feeling confused and unsettled, but I convinced myself that the isolation and monotony were playing tricks on my mind. Maybe the sounds had been animals outside, or wind through the metal roofing. The next night, the footsteps on the roof started again around midnight. This time I was ready for them. I went outside immediately and shouted up at whoever was up there, demanding that they come down because they were trespassing on private property. But again, there was no response, and I still couldn't see anyone on the roof. When I returned inside, I tried calling the police, but discovered that the phone line was dead. I checked my cell phone and found no signal either, which was strange because I'd had decent coverage in that area before. I examined all the phone connections and found everything properly plugged in. The lack of communication was making me increasingly nervous, especially since it seemed like too much of a coincidence that the phones would fail just when I needed them most. For about an hour, everything was quiet. I kept checking my phone for signal bars and testing the landline, but nothing worked. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard a loud crash outside the building, like something heavy had fallen from the roof and hit the ground hard. I grabbed my flashlight and ran outside to investigate, circling the entire perimeter of the warehouse. But I found nothing on the ground, no debris or any sign that something had fallen. It was as if the sound had come from nowhere. When I went back inside, I heard a noise that made my blood run cold. Something was moving around inside the warehouse, somewhere in the darkness beyond my flashlight beam. The sound was different from the roof footsteps, more immediate and threatening. That's when real fear set in. Whatever had been on the roof had somehow gotten inside, and I was no longer alone in that vast, empty space. I called out again, asking who was there, while slowly moving my flashlight beam across the warehouse, trying to locate the source of the movement. My heart was pounding as I crept forward, knowing I had only my flashlight and my bare hands to defend myself if this turned violent. The company policy prohibited security guards from carrying weapons, which suddenly seemed like a very poor decision. Then I saw it. Behind one of the large storage containers, a dark figure was standing motionless, only partially visible in the shadows. The shape was distinctly human, but somehow wrong, as if the proportions weren't quite right. I took several deep breaths, trying to build up the courage to shine my light directly on the figure. When I finally did, it vanished instantly, like it had never been there at all. But when I lowered the flashlight, I could see it again, standing in the same spot, watching me. My entire body began to tremble as a wave of malevolent energy seemed to fill the warehouse. This wasn't human. Whatever I was dealing with was something else entirely, something that radiated pure evil and malice. I'm a religious man, and in that moment, prayer was my only defense. I began reciting every prayer I could remember while slowly backing toward the exit, never taking my eyes off the spot where the figure stood. As I prayed, I heard something that will haunt me forever. A low, cynical laugh that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The voice that followed was deep and masculine, and what it said made my blood freeze in my veins. I am God. Those 3 words, spoken in that mocking tone, filled me with more terror than I've ever experienced. I ran for the exit as fast as my legs could carry me, not caring about my job or my responsibilities or anything except getting away from that place. I made it to my car in record time, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I drove away, I was crying from pure fear, something I'm not ashamed to admit. The drive home felt endless, and I kept checking my rearview mirror, expecting to see something following me. The next day, I went to the office and submitted my resignation, making up an excuse about family obligations rather than explaining the real reason. I couldn't tell them I was quitting because I'd encountered something demonic in their warehouse. Months later, I told my current supervisor about what had happened, and his reaction surprised me. He wasn't skeptical at all. Instead, He shared some information that I hadn't known about the warehouse's history. He told me that the building was relatively new, constructed in 2012, but it had been built on the site of an abandoned storage facility. Between 2008 and 2011, that old building had been used by organized crime for horrific purposes. According to local rumors, it had been a place where they tortured and murdered their enemies, as well as innocent people who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Even worse, there were stories that they had conducted satanic rituals there, believing it would give them power and protection from law enforcement. My supervisor was amazed that I had agreed to work there, especially on the night shift. He said he couldn't imagine the kind of negative energy that must linger in a place with such a dark history, and he called me brave for lasting as long as I did. But as the saying goes, what you don't know can't hurt you. If I had known about the site's past before accepting the job, I never would have set foot in that place. The idea of being alone at night in a building constructed on ground where such evil had taken place is absolutely terrifying. I'm working as a day shift security guard now at a small office complex, and I sleep much better knowing I'll never have to face anything like that again. Some places hold onto their darkness, and that warehouse is definitely one of them. I sometimes wonder if they've found anyone willing to work the night shift there, or if they've given up trying. Either way, I hope anyone considering that job knows what they're getting into. Some employment opportunities simply aren't worth the risk, no matter how much they pay. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.